In the late 11th century, the world of medieval Europe was restless. Kingdoms were fragile, peasants struggled, and the church stood as the one great unifying force. From pulpits and cathedrals, priests spoke of sin, salvation, and sacrifice. But one name, one city rose above all else: Jerusalem. For Christians, it was the holy city where Christ had walked, suffered, and ascended. For Muslims, it was the land sanctified by prophets and the site of Al-Aqsa, the third holiest shrine of Islam. For centuries, the city had changed hands, but by the late 11th century, it was firmly under Muslim control. When news reached Europe that Christian pilgrims were being harassed on their journey to the Holy Land, anger began to spread. Stories, often exaggerated, were told in churches. Pilgrims attacked, holy sites desecrated, the land of Christ slipping further away from Christian hands. At the same time, the Byzantine Empire, a Christian kingdom in the east, was losing battles against the powerful Seljuk Turks. Desperate, they sent a call for help to the west. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II seized this moment. Standing before a sea of nobles, knights, and peasants, he declared that God willed a great holy war. "Take up the cross," he urged, "and march to Jerusalem. Whoever dies in this cause, his sins shall be forgiven." The words ignited Europe like wildfire. Farmers abandoned their fields, knights polished their swords, and thousands of ordinary men and women stitched a red cross to their garments. The Crusades had begun, a series of wars that would rage for nearly 2 centuries, shaping not only the destiny of Europe and the Middle East but also the future of civilizations. Before we dive deep into this epic journey of faith, war, and power, make sure to subscribe. Join us as we unravel the Crusades chapter by chapter, bringing history to life while you learn and dream. The closing years of the 11th century marked a turning point in both European and Middle Eastern history. By this time, Western Europe had been gradually emerging from the so-called Dark Ages. The feudal system dominated everyday life, where kings, lords, and knights maintained order, while peasants worked the land. Religion, however, stood above all. The Catholic Church not only guided the souls of millions but also influenced kings and noblemen. In this deeply religious society, Jerusalem held a unique place. It was believed to be the very center of the Christian world, the site where Jesus Christ had preached, been crucified, and resurrected. Pilgrimage to the Holy Land was considered one of the holiest acts a Christian could perform. At the same time, Jerusalem and the broader region of Palestine had long been under Muslim rule. Since the 7th century, Muslim dynasties had controlled the city, but they had often allowed Christian pilgrims to visit relatively freely. By the late 11th century, however, the balance of power was shifting. The Seljuk Turks, a new and powerful Muslim force, had risen across the Middle East. They inflicted heavy defeats on the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Christian kingdom that still controlled Constantinople and parts of Anatolia. At the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, the Byzantine army was crushed, and most of Asia Minor fell into Seljuk hands. For the Byzantine Empire, this was a disaster. With enemies pressing from the east and internal conflicts weakening their throne, the empire found itself on the brink of collapse. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos saw no choice but to seek help. Though relations between the Catholic Church in Rome and the Orthodox Church in Constantinople had soured in the Great Schism of 1054, Alexios nevertheless appealed to the West. He asked Pope Urban II for assistance against the advancing Turks. For Urban, this request presented not just an opportunity to aid fellow Christians but also to extend the power of the papacy across Europe and to assert Rome's leadership over the Orthodox Church. In November 1095, Pope Urban II traveled to Clermont in France. There, at the Council of Clermont, he delivered a sermon that would change the course of history. Accounts vary, but chroniclers describe a fiery speech in which the Pope urged Christians to take up arms in defense of their brothers in the East and to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. He promised that those who fought in this holy cause would receive a full remission of their sins, a guarantee of salvation. His words electrified the crowd. Shouts of Deus vult, God wills it, filled the air. From that moment, the idea of the crusade was born. The call spread rapidly across Europe. Nobles, knights, peasants, and even children felt compelled to join. Many were driven by genuine religious devotion, while others saw opportunities for wealth, land, and adventure. Some joined to escape debts or feudal obligations, and still others simply followed the excitement sweeping across Christendom. It was not only professional soldiers who took the cross, common people too began to march eastward, inspired by the promise of heavenly reward. The earliest wave of recruits became known as the People's Crusade. Led by Peter the Hermit, a charismatic preacher, tens of thousands of peasants, artisans, and minor knights set off in 1096, long before the organized armies of Europe were ready. Lacking discipline, supplies, and strategy, this massive crowd caused chaos wherever it passed. In some places, Jewish communities in Europe were attacked and massacred, as crusaders wrongly directed their religious zeal into violence against local minorities. When the People's Crusade finally reached the edges of Byzantine territory, it became a burden on Emperor Alexios, who had not anticipated such a disorganized mass of pilgrims turned soldiers. Alexios ferried them across the Bosporus into Asia Minor, where they quickly faced the military strength of the Seljuk Turks. The result was a disaster. At the Battle of Civitate in October 1096, the Turks slaughtered nearly the entire People's Crusade. Only a handful survived. This catastrophic beginning demonstrated the difference between raw enthusiasm and genuine military force. Yet the Real Crusade was still to come. By late 1096 and early 1097, the official armies of the First Crusade began to gather. 4 major contingents were formed, each led by powerful nobles: Raymond of Toulouse from southern France, Bohemond of Taranto from Norman Italy, Godfrey of Bouillon from Lorraine, and Hugh of Vermandois, the brother of the French king. Unlike the People's Crusade, these were seasoned knights with proper equipment, armies, and resources. Their combined numbers may have reached 60,000 men, though only a fraction were actual knights. The majority were infantry, archers, and camp followers, civilians who traveled with the armies. When these forces arrived in Byzantine lands, Emperor Alexios faced a delicate challenge. On one hand, he had asked for help, but on the other, he feared that such a large, armed force could turn against him. To secure his interests, he demanded that the Crusader leaders swear an oath of loyalty, promising to return any former Byzantine lands they recaptured. Reluctantly, most agreed. This arrangement laid the foundation for a fragile alliance between Byzantines and Crusaders. The Crusade officially began with the march into Asia Minor. In 1097, the Crusaders besieged the city of Nicaea, an important Seljuk stronghold. After weeks of fighting, the city surrendered, not to the Crusaders directly but to the Byzantines thanks to Alexios's diplomacy. This early victory raised morale and showed that the campaign was possible. The march across Asia Minor, however, was brutal. The scorching heat, lack of water, and constant ambushes from Seljuk forces tested the Crusaders' endurance. At the Battle of Dorylaeum in July 1097, the Crusaders faced a massive Turkish army. Initially overwhelmed, the knights managed to regroup and secure a hard-fought victory. This battle marked a turning point, proving that disciplined European knights could withstand and defeat the mobile cavalry tactics of the Turks. After months of hardship, the Crusaders reached Antioch in October 1097. Antioch was one of the great cities of the Near East, strategically vital for controlling access to Syria and Palestine. The siege of Antioch became one of the most grueling episodes of the entire crusade. For 8 long months, the Crusaders encircled the city, suffering from famine, disease, and desertions. Supplies were scarce, and many knights sold their horses or resorted to eating whatever they could find. Yet they held their ground. Finally, in June 1098, Antioch fell, but not without further challenges. Soon after capturing the city, the Crusaders themselves were besieged by a massive Muslim relief army led by Kerboga of Mosul. Trapped and exhausted, their situation seemed hopeless. But within the city, a mysterious discovery changed the morale. A peasant claimed to have found the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side on the cross. Whether authentic or not, this relic inspired the Crusaders to believe they were under divine protection. With renewed faith, they sallied out and defeated Kerboga's forces. Antioch was now in Crusader hands, though internal rivalries among leaders soon emerged over control of the city. Despite divisions, the march to Jerusalem continued. By the summer of 1099, the Crusaders finally reached their ultimate goal. Jerusalem, by then controlled by the Fatimid dynasty of Egypt, was heavily fortified and defended. The Crusaders, weary and diminished in numbers, nevertheless laid siege in June 1099. 4 weeks, they constructed siege towers and battering rams, enduring both fierce resistance and the harsh summer heat. On July 15, 1099, the Crusaders launched their final assault. Against overwhelming odds, they breached the walls and stormed the city. What followed was a massacre that horrified even some contemporaries. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were slaughtered in the thousands. Chroniclers describe streets running with blood, though accounts vary in exaggeration. The brutality cemented the Crusaders' reputation in the region and left a legacy of bitterness for centuries to come. Once the killing ended, the Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and several other Crusader states: the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. Godfrey of Bouillon was named Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, refusing the title of king out of humility, though he effectively ruled the new kingdom. The First Crusade had achieved what seemed impossible. A Christian army from distant Europe had captured Jerusalem and carved out territories in the heart of the Muslim world. The impact was immense. In Europe, the crusade was hailed as a divine victory, proof that God had blessed the mission. For the Church, it greatly enhanced the power and prestige of the papacy. Thousands of knights returned home as heroes, while others remained to govern and defend the new Crusader states. For the Muslim world, the loss of Jerusalem was a shocking defeat, though unity among Muslim rulers was still lacking at this stage. The First Crusade had ended in triumph for the Crusaders, but it was only the beginning of a much longer struggle. The fragile states they had created would soon face constant attacks, and future crusades would be called to defend or recapture these territories. What started as a desperate plea from Byzantium and a fiery sermon in Clermont had unleashed 2 centuries of holy war. The victory of the First Crusade had stunned both East and West. Against all odds, a fragmented army of European knights had marched thousands of miles, fought through hunger and disease, and seized the holy city of Jerusalem. From that triumph emerged 4 fragile Crusader states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. Yet their survival depended on constant reinforcements, strong leadership, and unity, qualities that soon proved scarce. In the years that followed, the Crusader states existed in a precarious balance. Surrounded by larger and often more powerful Muslim neighbors, their position was never secure. The Latin settlers who stayed behind in the Levant relied on incoming pilgrims, soldiers, and supplies from Europe. They built castles, fortified cities, and attempted to establish a new life in the East. But beneath this fragile surface, tensions simmered. Rivalries among Crusader lords weakened their unity, while Muslim leaders, though often divided among themselves, gradually began to regroup. The first blow came in the north. The County of Edessa, the earliest and most vulnerable of the Crusader states, sat on the frontier closest to Muslim power. Its position was exposed, and its defenses were weaker compared to Jerusalem or Antioch. In 1144, the Muslim ruler Zengi, Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, launched a campaign against Edessa. A skilled commander and a determined leader, Zengi managed to capture the city after a short but decisive siege. The fall of Edessa sent shockwaves across the Christian world. For the first time, one of the Crusader states had collapsed. News of Edessa's fall reached Europe with devastating impact. The memory of the First Crusade's success was still alive, and the loss was seen not just as a political setback but as a spiritual disaster. Pilgrims and travelers carried the tale across Christendom, and the Church once again called for action. This time the response would be even greater. Pope Eugenius III issued a papal bull known as Quantum Predecessors in 1145, calling upon the faithful to take up the cross once more. His appeal was soon supported by the most influential preacher of the age, Bernard of Clairvaux. A charismatic Cistercian monk, Bernard's fiery sermons moved kings and peasants alike. He promised the same indulgences granted by Urban 2 decades earlier, the remission of sins for all who joined the holy cause. He described the fall of Edessa as a wound on Christendom itself, demanding vengeance and redemption. This time, the crusade would not be led only by nobles and knights. For the first time in history, reigning kings would take the cross. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, 2 of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, pledged themselves to the holy war. Their participation gave the new crusade an aura of majesty and strength. Thousands rallied to their banners, convinced that with kings leading the way, victory was assured. Preparations were vast and costly. In 1147, 2 great armies set out separately, the Germans under Conrad III and the French under Louis VII. Their plan was to march through Byzantine territory into Asia Minor and then proceed toward the Holy Land. Yet from the very beginning the expedition was plagued by difficulties. The Germans marched first. Crossing into Asia Minor, they faced the familiar challenges of heat, lack of supplies, and constant harassment by Turkish forces. At the Battle of Dorylaeum in 1147, Conrad's army was ambushed and nearly destroyed. Thousands were killed and the survivors retreated in disarray. Conrad himself was wounded and forced to withdraw to Constantinople to regroup. The French fared little better. Louis VII's forces, though larger and better organized, also suffered from Turkish ambushes in the rugged terrain of Anatolia. The long march drained morale, and disputes with the Byzantine allies further complicated the campaign. By the time the French and Germans finally reached the Levant, their armies had been drastically reduced in size. The dream of a mighty united force had already crumbled. In the Holy Land, the Crusaders met with the local leaders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The great question was where to strike. Many argued that the logical target was Edessa, whose fall had sparked the crusade in the first place. Yet by now, Edessa was firmly in Muslim hands and heavily fortified. Retaking it seemed nearly impossible. Instead, the Crusaders chose a different target, the city of Damascus. Damascus was not only one of the most important cities in the region but also a symbol of Muslim power. Capturing it would secure the eastern frontier of Jerusalem and strike a decisive blow against Islam in the Levant. In July 1148, the combined forces of the Crusaders and the Kingdom of Jerusalem marched on Damascus. The siege of Damascus was expected to be the great triumph of the Second Crusade, but it turned into a disaster. At first, the Crusaders made rapid progress, advancing through orchards and gardens that surrounded the city. However, the defenders fought fiercely, launching ambushes and counterattacks from hidden positions. Supplies ran short, and the Crusaders soon found themselves vulnerable. After just 4 days, with morale collapsing and Muslim reinforcements on the way, the leaders decided to retreat. The failure at Damascus shattered the crusade. The great armies of Europe, led by kings, had accomplished nothing. Worse, their defeat undermined the very credibility of the crusading movement. Instead of restoring confidence, the Second Crusade revealed the difficulties of coordinating such vast forces across hostile terrain. Louis VII and Conrad III returned home in humiliation, their reputations tarnished. Bernard of Clairvaux, once hailed as the voice of God's will, faced bitter criticism for his role in promoting the failed campaign. He defended himself by claiming that the sins of the Crusaders had brought about their downfall, but the damage was done. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the idea of the Crusade was broken. For the Muslim world, the failure of the Second Crusade was a turning point. It showed that the Crusaders could be defeated, even when led by the most powerful monarchs of Europe. It encouraged Muslim rulers to continue their struggle and paved the way for future leaders like Nur ad-Din and eventually Saladin Ayyubi to take the initiative. Meanwhile, the Crusader states remained vulnerable. The Kingdom of Jerusalem still stood, but the loss of Edessa was permanent. The fragile balance of power continued, with Christians clinging to their enclaves along the coast while Muslim forces pressed from the interior. The dream of expanding Christian rule in the East had been crushed. The Second Crusade ended not with triumph but with disillusionment. It revealed the limits of European power in the East and the dangers of overambition. What had begun as a grand response to the fall of Edessa ended in failure at the walls of Damascus. The Crusaders returned home weary and divided, while the Muslims gained confidence for the struggles that lay ahead. The legacy of the Second Crusade was complex. In Europe, it dampened enthusiasm for future expeditions, though it did not extinguish it entirely. In the Holy Land, it exposed the fragility of Christian rule and foreshadowed the challenges that would lead to even greater conflicts in the years to come. The Crusades were far from over. Indeed, the stage was now set for the rise of leaders who would change the face of the conflict. Men like Nur ad-Din and ultimately Saladin. The Second Crusade had ended in humiliation for Europe. The great kings of France and Germany had marched across the continent with hopes of restoring the balance of power in the East, but their campaign collapsed in failure at Damascus. For a time, enthusiasm for new expeditions waned. Yet events in the Middle East would soon rekindle the flame of the crusading spirit, this time with even greater intensity. By the middle of the 12th century, the Muslim world was undergoing its own transformation. After decades of disunity, new leaders began to rise who sought to unite the fractured Islamic states against the Crusaders. Among these figures, one name stood above all others: Al-ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. Saladin was born in Tikrit in 1137, the son of a Kurdish family in the service of Muslim rulers in Syria. He grew up during the era of the Second Crusade, witnessing firsthand the rivalry and weakness that plagued both Muslims and Crusaders. Over time, through military skill, diplomacy, and an ability to inspire loyalty, He rose to power in Egypt and Syria. By the 1170s, he had established the Ayyubid dynasty, uniting much of the Muslim Near East under his command. Unlike many rulers before him, Saladin combined religious conviction with political vision. His leadership was infused with the idea of jihad, not simply as conquest, but as a sacred struggle to defend Islam and reclaim Jerusalem. The turning point came in 1187. At the Battle of Ain near the Sea of Galilee, Saladin achieved a decisive victory over the forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusader army, led by King Guy of Lusignan and the fiery knight Reynold de Chatillon, was lured into the open under the burning summer sun. Surrounded and cut off from water, the Crusaders were annihilated. Thousands were captured, including the king himself. Reynold, infamous for his cruelty against Muslim pilgrims and caravans, was executed by Saladin's own hand. With the Crusader army destroyed, the road to Jerusalem lay open. In October 1187, Saladin entered the Holy City. Unlike the bloody conquest of 1099, when Crusaders had massacred the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, Saladin's entry was marked by clemency. While some were enslaved or ransomed, many were allowed to leave peacefully. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, desecrated during Christian rule, were restored to Islamic worship. The capture of Jerusalem sent shockwaves throughout Europe. The fall of the Holy City was a catastrophe for Christendom. Jerusalem had been the crown jewel of the First Crusade, the symbol of God's favor and Christian triumph. Now, after nearly 90 years, it was gone. The news reached Europe in the winter of 1187, and the reaction was one of grief and fury. Pope Urban III, upon hearing the news, is said to have died of shock. His successor, Pope Gregory VIII, issued a new call to arms, known as the Papal Bull Audita Tremendi. The Third Crusade had begun. This crusade would be unlike the ones before it. For the first time, three of Europe's most powerful rulers committed themselves to the cause: Richard I of England, known as the Lionheart, Philip II of France, called Augustus, and Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. Their combined power promised a crusade of unprecedented scale. Frederick Barbarossa was the first to depart. At over 60 years of age, he was a veteran ruler who had spent decades consolidating the vast empire of Germany and Italy. In 1189 he led a massive army across Hungary, the Balkans, and into Byzantine lands. But fate intervened. In June 1190, while crossing the Salif River in Anatolia, Barbarossa drowned. His sudden death threw the German crusade into chaos. Many soldiers returned home, while a smaller contingent continued under his son Frederick of Swabia, eventually reaching the Levant. But the great imperial army had been lost. Meanwhile, Richard of England and Philip of France prepared their fleets. Richard was one of the most celebrated warriors of his age, famed for his courage, military genius, and relentless determination. Crowned King of England in 1189, he devoted nearly all his energy to the crusade. Philip II, more cautious and calculating, nevertheless joined him. In 1190, both kings set out by sea, stopping first in Sicily. Their journey was not without conflict. In Sicily, disputes arose over local politics and supplies. Richard, ever fiery, clashed with the Sicilian ruler Tancred of Lecce, eventually capturing the city of Messina before forcing concessions. This set the tone for Richard's campaign: bold, aggressive, and uncompromising. In 1191, Richard continued toward the Holy Land, but a storm drove part of his fleet to Cyprus. There he encountered Isaac Komnenos, the island's independent ruler. When Isaac resisted, Richard invaded. In a swift campaign he captured Cyprus, adding it to the Crusader arsenal. The island would become a vital base for Crusader operations for centuries to come. Finally, Richard reached the Levant, where the Crusader cause hung by a thread. Since Jerusalem's fall, the remaining Crusader states had struggled to survive. The city of Acre, a key port, had been besieged by Crusader and Muslim forces alike for nearly 2 years. When Richard and Philip arrived in 1191, they joined the siege. The capture of Acre became one of the defining moments of the Third Crusade. With reinforcements from Europe, the Crusaders tightened their grip. Saladin's forces fought fiercely to relieve the city, but the Crusaders held firm. In July 1191, Acre surrendered. The victory was hailed as a triumph, but tensions soon erupted among the victors. Richard and Philip quarreled over the spoils and the future leadership of the crusade. Eventually, Philip, frustrated and ill, returned to France, leaving Richard as the dominant figure in the campaign. Richard wasted no time. With his reputation as a fearless commander, he reorganized the Crusader army and marched south along the coast. At the Battle of Arsuf in September 1191, he faced Saladin directly. The Muslim army launched wave after wave of cavalry charges, hoping to break the Crusaders' formation. Richard, however, maintained discipline, waiting for the right moment. Finally, he unleashed a counterattack led by his heavy cavalry. The Crusader knights smashed through the Muslim lines, forcing Saladin to retreat. Arsuf was a significant victory, proving Richard's tactical brilliance and restoring Crusader morale. Despite these successes, Jerusalem remained out of reach. Richard advanced close to the city but hesitated. He knew that even if he captured Jerusalem, holding it would be nearly impossible without secure supply lines. Saladin's forces could surround and starve the Crusaders at will. Moreover, divisions among the Crusader leadership made unity difficult. Richard weighed the risks carefully, aware that a failed attempt could doom the entire crusade. Instead, Richard and Saladin engaged in a series of negotiations and skirmishes over the next year. Both men recognized each other's strength and, despite being enemies, shared a degree of mutual respect. Chroniclers often highlight their chivalry, Richard for his courage, Saladin for his generosity. Stories circulated of Saladin sending Richard fresh horses after battle, or fruit and ice to cool his fever. Though not all such tales may be factual, they reflect the enduring image of these two legendary figures. By 1192, both sides were exhausted. Richard faced mounting pressure to return home, where his brother John and King Philip threatened his realm. Saladin, too, needed respite to consolidate his rule. After months of back and forth, the two leaders agreed to a truce. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in September 1192, allowed the Crusaders to retain control of a coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa. Most importantly, Christian pilgrims were granted safe access to Jerusalem, which remained under Muslim rule. The Third Crusade ended without the grand victory that Europe had hoped for. Jerusalem was not retaken, yet the Crusader presence in the Holy Land was preserved. Richard departed for England, his reputation as the Lionheart secured, though he would face captivity and political struggles upon his return. Saladin remained master of Jerusalem, his stature as the champion of Islam unchallenged. He died the following year in 1193, leaving behind a legacy of honor, faith, and leadership. The impact of the Third Crusade was immense. In Europe, Richard's exploits became legendary, celebrated in song and story. The image of the chivalrous knight facing the noble Muslim adversary shaped medieval imagination for centuries. In the Muslim world, Saladin became a symbol of unity and resistance, remembered as the leader who restored Jerusalem to Islam. Yet beneath the legends lay a harsher reality. The Crusades had become a cycle of conquest and loss, of temporary victories and lasting bitterness. The Third Crusade had shown both the limits of European ambition and the resilience of the Muslim world. It did not end the struggle, far from it. Instead, it set the stage for further campaigns as future generations sought once more to seize or defend the Holy City. The Holy War was far from over. The dawn of the 13th century brought a renewed sense of religious fervor across Europe. In the year 1198, only a few years after the Third Crusade had ended with a bitter truce rather than a triumphant victory, Pope Innocent III ascended to the papal throne. He was young, determined, and filled with a burning conviction that the Holy Land must once again be reclaimed for Christendom. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 to Saladin had shocked the Christian world, and though Richard the Lionheart had fought valiantly to secure the coast, the Holy City itself remained firmly in Muslim hands. Innocent III envisioned a new crusade, one that would not merely reclaim lost territories but would establish papal authority and unify Christendom under the cross. From the pulpits of Europe, his call went forth. Knights, nobles, and commoners alike were urged to take up the cross, to leave behind their lands and their quarrels, and march for the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre. Preachers stirred towns and villages with vivid tales of sacred duty, salvation, and eternal reward. Yet, unlike the previous expeditions, this crusade would not be led by kings. The monarchs of Europe were either weary, embroiled in their own conflicts, or reluctant to undertake another costly adventure. Instead, the leadership of the Fourth Crusade fell into the hands of powerful French and Flemish nobles, Theobald III of Champagne, Louis of Blois, Baldwin of Flanders, and others. They were men of ambition and faith, but they lacked the centralized royal backing that had defined the Second and Third Crusades. From its inception, the Fourth Crusade carried the seeds of both hope and disaster. The plan was bold but fraught with risk. The Crusaders agreed that instead of marching overland, they would sail directly to the eastern Mediterranean, striking swiftly at Egypt, the strategic heart of Muslim power. From there they would march to Jerusalem. To achieve this they needed ships, provisions and safe passage across the seas. And for that they turned to the most powerful maritime republic of the time, Venice. The Venetian bargain. The Republic of Venice was no stranger to the Crusades. Its merchants had long profited from the flow of goods between East and West, and its fleets had carried crusaders before. When the envoys of the Fourth Crusade arrived in 1201 to negotiate transport for an army of more than 30,000 men, the Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo saw an opportunity. A shrewd and experienced ruler, Dandolo was in his 90s, partially blind, yet razor-sharp in both politics and commerce. He promised the Crusaders a fleet large enough to carry their entire army to Egypt, along with provisions for 9 months. But the price was steep, 85,000 silver marks, a sum so enormous that it rivaled the annual income of the richest kingdoms of Europe. The agreement was made. Venice would halt its trade for a year, construct the fleet and prepare for the grand expedition. But when the Crusaders began arriving in 1202 at the Venetian lagoon, the reality became clear. They were far fewer than expected. Instead of 30,000, only about 12,000 to 15,000 men had gathered, knights, infantry and non-combatants combined. And worse, their treasury fell short. They could not pay the full amount owed to Venice. Weeks turned into months as the Crusaders, camped on the islands and docks of Venice, negotiated, pleaded, and despaired. The fleet was ready, but without payment the Venetians would not sail. Here the first great twist of the Fourth Crusade emerged. Doge Dandolo, ever pragmatic, proposed an alternative. If the Crusaders would assist Venice in recapturing the Dalmatian city of Zara, modern-day Zadar in Croatia, which had rebelled against Venetian control and sought protection under the King of Hungary, their debt could be reduced. It was a shocking proposal. Zara was a Christian city, its people Catholic, its ruler a Crusader himself. The idea of turning swords meant for the Holy Land against fellow Christians appalled many within the crusading host. Yet hunger, debt, and frustration gnawed at their resolve. After heated debates, oaths broken, and the papal ban looming, the Crusaders reluctantly agreed. In November 1202, the mighty fleet sailed across the Adriatic Sea, banners of the cross fluttering in the wind, only to lay siege to a city of their own faith. The Siege of Zara. The Siege of Zara marked the first stain upon the Fourth Crusade's holy purpose. The city, though fortified, was ill-prepared to withstand such a massive force. Venetian galleys blockaded its harbor while Crusader siege engines battered its walls. Appeals from the defenders to the Pope and to Christendom were sent in desperation, but none came in time to save them. For several days the Crusaders bombarded the walls, and in mid-November, Zara surrendered. The aftermath was grim. The city was looted, its inhabitants scattered, its allegiance forcibly restored to Venice. Pope Innocent III, upon hearing of this treachery, was enraged. He excommunicated the entire crusading army and the Venetians for their attack on a Christian city. Letters of condemnation flew across Europe, and the moral foundation of the crusade crumbled further. Though the excommunication was later lifted for the Crusaders, but not for Venice, the damage was done. The Fourth Crusade had begun not with the liberation of Jerusalem, but with the plunder of a Catholic port. Many knights, disgusted by the betrayal of their vows, abandoned the campaign and returned home. Yet the majority pressed on, bound by their debts, their oaths, and the sheer inertia of the enterprise. It was in this fragile, compromised state that a new proposal emerged, one that would change the course of the crusade forever. Byzantine intrigues and the path to Constantinople. Far to the east, the Byzantine Empire was embroiled in its own dynastic struggles. Emperor Alexios III Angelos ruled in Constantinople, but his throne was shaky and his nephew, the exiled Prince Alexios IV, sought to reclaim it. The young prince fled to the Crusader camp with a tantalizing offer. If they would help him restore his father, Isaac II Angelos, to the throne, he would provide them with immense wealth, pay off their debts to Venice, supply them with an army and personally lead them to the Holy Land. It was a promise of salvation for the cash-strapped Crusaders, and a betrayal of their original purpose. The proposal split the Crusader leadership. Some argued that meddling in Byzantine politics was far from their holy mission. Others, especially the Venetians, saw profit and strategic advantage. The idea of securing the cooperation of the Eastern Roman Empire for the Crusade was tempting. Ever since the First Crusade, relations between the Latins and the Byzantines had been strained. Here was a chance to mend the rift, or exploit it. By early 1203, after long debates and mounting pressure, the Crusaders set sail from Zara, not for Egypt or the Holy Land, but for the glittering city of Constantinople. The decision marked a turning point, one that would lead to one of the most infamous episodes in medieval history: the march toward betrayal. As the Crusader fleet approached the Bosporus, the splendor of Constantinople rose before them: golden domes, massive walls, and bustling harbors. It was the largest, richest city in Christendom, a beacon of culture and commerce. Yet the Crusaders came not as allies, but as enforcers of a bargain made with a dispossessed prince. Inside the city, Emperor Alexios III wavered. His people, already suspicious of the Latins, saw the Crusaders as both a threat and an opportunity. The Crusaders encamped outside the mighty Theodosian walls, and tensions simmered. Negotiations, skirmishes, and failed promises stretched the months. Supplies ran low and morale began to fray. The Crusaders had neither the resources to storm the city nor the patience to wait forever. Part 1 of the Fourth Crusade closes with the Crusaders trapped between their vows and their circumstances, too indebted to retreat, too compromised to proceed honorably, and too entangled with Venetian ambitions to return to their original mission. The Holy Land lay far to the south, untouched and unconquered, while the greatest city of the Christian East loomed before them like a forbidden prize. The spring of 1204 began with tension in Constantinople. The Crusaders were camped outside the walls. The Venetians kept their ships ready in the harbor. Inside the city the people were divided. Some supported Alexios IV, who had promised them wealth and alliance. Others hated the Latin presence and wanted them gone. Emperor Alexios IV struggled to keep control. He had little money left to pay the Crusaders. Taxes had been raised and the population was angry. Riots started in the streets. The situation grew worse each day. By early February the people of Constantinople rose against Alexios IV. A palace coup overthrew him. Alexios IV was imprisoned and later strangled. His ally, Isaac II, also died in captivity. A new emperor, Alexios V. Doukas, took power. He was a soldier and a nationalist. He refused to honor the promises made to the Crusaders. He shut the gates of the city and prepared for war. The Crusaders felt betrayed. They had been promised money, food, and support. Now they faced an angry city with no reward for their struggles. The leaders of the Fourth Crusade gathered to decide their next move. They were deep in debt to the Venetians. They had no funds to return home. Some wanted to attack the city and take what they had been denied. Others feared the wrath of the Pope. Pope Innocent III had already excommunicated them once for attacking Christian lands. Yet the lure of wealth and the need for survival were stronger than papal warnings. In March 1204 they made their decision. Constantinople would be theirs. Preparations for the assault began. The Crusaders and Venetians repaired their siege engines. They built ladders, siege towers, and reinforced their ships for naval attack. The Venetians prepared their fleet to breach the Golden Horn, the great chain that guarded the harbor. The Crusaders divided their forces along the walls. The plan was to attack by both land and sea. The defenders of Constantinople strengthened their walls and armed their towers. They believed the city was impregnable. For centuries, Constantinople had withstood sieges from Persians, Arabs, Rus, and Bulgars. The double walls and strong gates had never been breached. On April 9, 1204, the first assault began. Crusaders launched their attack from both the landward side and from ships. Siege towers rolled forward and ladders were raised. The defenders rained down arrows, stones, and Greek fire. The attack failed. Many Crusaders were wounded. Ships were set ablaze. The defenders cheered their victory. The Crusaders, however, were not discouraged. They regrouped and prepared for another strike. On April 12, the final assault began. The weather favored the attackers. A strong wind pushed the Venetian ships close to the sea walls. Crusaders climbed from ship decks onto the battlements. After fierce fighting they gained a foothold. One by one the towers fell. Gates were forced open. Panic spread in the city. The defenders retreated, and Emperor Alexios V fled during the night. By morning the Crusaders had entered Constantinople. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in medieval history. For 3 days Constantinople was plundered. Churches, monasteries, and homes were looted. Relics, icons, and treasures were carried off. The great Hagia Sophia was desecrated. Soldiers broke open its altars and drank wine from holy chalices. Gold mosaics were torn from the walls. Women were assaulted and citizens were killed in the streets. The wealth of centuries vanished in a few days. The Venetians focused on treasures of art and relics. They loaded their ships with bronze horses, precious marbles, and sacred objects. Many of these treasures still stand in Venice today, such as the famous bronze horses of St. Mark's Basilica. The Crusaders divided the remaining loot among themselves. They melted down gold and silver to pay their debts. The once great city was left broken and humiliated. After the sack, the Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople. Baldwin of Flanders was crowned emperor. The Venetians claimed key ports, islands, and trade routes. The Byzantine Empire was fragmented. Several Greek states emerged in exile, including the Empire of Nicaea, the Despotate of Epirus, and the Empire of Trebizond. The dream of a united Christendom was shattered. Instead of liberating the Holy Land, the Fourth Crusade had destroyed the greatest Christian city of the East. News of the sack shocked the Christian world. Pope Innocent III condemned the violence but reluctantly accepted the new reality. He absolved the Crusaders after learning of their success, even though it was not the mission he had planned. Relations between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches suffered a fatal blow. The wounds of 1204 deepened the schism that had begun in 1054. Many Orthodox Christians saw the Latins not as saviors but as destroyers. The Latin Empire struggled to survive. It faced resistance from the Greek states and constant attacks from Bulgars and Turks. Within a few decades, most of its territory was lost. In 1261, the Byzantine Empire was restored under Michael VIII Palaiologos. But it never recovered its former glory. The sack of 1204 weakened Byzantium so deeply that it became vulnerable to future invasions, including the Ottoman conquest in 1453. The Fourth Crusade marked a turning point in the history of the Crusades. It showed how the original goal of reclaiming the Holy Land had been lost. Political ambition, financial debt, and the lure of wealth had replaced religious purpose. The Crusaders had become conquerors of fellow Christians rather than defenders of the faith. For the people of Constantinople, the memory of 1204 remained a scar for centuries. Many chroniclers of the time wrote about the horror. Nicetas Choniates, a Byzantine historian, described the looting and desecration with deep sorrow. Latin writers, though proud of their conquest, also admitted the excesses. The crusading ideal had been stained. Trust between East and West was broken. Trade routes were altered, and Venetian power grew in the Mediterranean. The empire they helped create served their commercial interests more than the cause of the cross. The Fourth Crusade ended in 1204, but its consequences lasted long after. The Byzantine Empire, though restored later, was a shadow of its past. The Crusader States in the Holy Land received little support from this venture. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. Pilgrims continued to travel to the Holy Sepulchre, but the dream of a grand Christian victory faded. Historians today see the Fourth Crusade as a tragic diversion. It began with a papal call to free the Holy Land. It ended with the plunder of a Christian city. The motives were mixed: religious fervor, Venetian trade ambitions, Crusader debts, and Byzantine politics. Together they created a storm that changed the map of the Eastern Mediterranean. For Venice, the crusade was a triumph of commerce and naval power. For the Crusaders, it was both a success and a curse. They gained land and riches but lost the moral foundation of their cause. For the Byzantines, it was a disaster that marked the beginning of the end. The fall of Constantinople in 1204 weakened Christian defenses and paved the way for future Ottoman expansion. The Fourth Crusade stands as a reminder of how easily great movements can be twisted by greed and politics. It also shows how fragile alliances can be when trust is broken. The scars it left on East-West relations were never fully healed. Even today, the memory of 1204 is recalled in discussions of the long divide between Catholic and Orthodox Christians. As the Crusaders settled into their new empire, many realized their journey to Jerusalem had ended far from its intended goal. The Holy City was still distant, and their vows were unfulfilled. Yet they built castles, ruled territories, and forged new trade routes. Their descendants would remain in these lands for a time, but the era of great crusading unity was over. The Fifth Crusade emerged in a world still restless from the failures and betrayals of the Fourth Crusade. After Constantinople had fallen not to Muslim hands but to fellow Christians, the Holy Land remained under Ayyubid control, and Jerusalem was still beyond the reach of Western Christendom. In 1213, Pope Innocent III, who had earlier launched the disastrous Fourth Crusade, called again for a holy war to reclaim the city of Christ's Passion. He issued the papal bull Quia Maior, urging kings, nobles, clergy, and common people to take up the cross. The memory of past failures hung over Europe, but the call resonated with a new generation who believed the shame of the previous crusade could be redeemed. This time the plan was more ambitious. Instead of striking directly at the Holy Land, The new crusade was designed to weaken Muslim power by cutting at its roots, Egypt. Egypt was the seat of the Ayyubid dynasty, founded by the great Saladin and now ruled by his brother Al-Adil, also known as Sultan al-Kamil. The papacy believed that by conquering Egypt, they could cripple the Muslim world's wealth, secure a base of operations, and then recover Jerusalem more easily. This strategy reflected growing recognition of Egypt's strategic and economic importance. Pope Innocent III did not live to see his plan take full form. He died in 1216 and his successor Pope Honorius III inherited the crusade. Recruitment had already begun across Europe. Preachers spread the message from cathedral pulpits and town squares. Kings were hesitant after the failures of the past. Neither the King of France, Philip II, nor the King of England, John Lackland, would take the cross. Instead, the Fifth Crusade relied on second-rank monarchs, ambitious nobles and devout clergy. The most notable royal figure to answer the call was King Andrew II of Hungary. Alongside him came Duke Leopold VI of Austria, Count William I of Holland, and a host of knights from Germany and France. Later, John of Brienne, the titular king of Jerusalem by marriage, would join them. The crusade also received strong support from the papacy's spiritual army. Cardinal Pelagius, a papal legate, would play a central and controversial role. The early stages of the crusade were marked by scattered departures. In 1217, the first waves of crusaders gathered in the port cities of southern Europe. The Hungarian king marched with his army through the Balkans, meeting contingents from Austria and Germany. Their destination was Acre, the stronghold and capital of the diminished kingdom of Jerusalem, which still clung to a strip of coast in the Levant. The mood was uncertain. Some sought redemption, others adventure or profit, and a few genuine pilgrimage. When the crusaders arrived in Acre, they were faced with the familiar challenge: where to strike. Their ultimate goal, as envisioned by the papacy, was Egypt, but many crusaders, particularly the Hungarians, were more interested in immediate campaigns in the Holy Land. They launched a series of raids in late 1217 against Muslim-held territories in Galilee and around Mount Tabor. These expeditions achieved little. The crusaders were poorly coordinated, supplies were scarce, and the enemy avoided major confrontation. Sultan al-Kamil, ruling from Cairo, was cautious and kept his forces largely in reserve, preferring to harass and delay rather than risk open battle. By the end of 1217, King Andrew II had grown weary of the campaign. He had fulfilled his vow to take the cross but was unwilling to prolong his stay. He returned to Hungary, leaving behind only a fraction of his army. The departure of one of the key leaders was a blow to morale and planning. Leadership began to shift toward John of Brienne and the papal representatives, especially Cardinal Pelagius, who was determined to steer the crusade according to the Pope's vision. In the spring of 1218 the crusade entered its decisive phase. Reinforcements arrived by sea from Flanders, Frisia, and other parts of northern Europe. These seafaring crusaders brought ships, engineers, and a determination to open a new front. The target was declared Damietta, a fortress city in the Nile Delta of Egypt. Damietta was considered the key to Egypt. If the crusaders could take it, they believed they could bargain for Jerusalem or march directly on Cairo. The choice of Damietta was not without controversy. Some argued that attacking Egypt was a dangerous diversion from the true goal of liberating Jerusalem. Others feared the logistical nightmare of campaigning in the Nile Delta, with its treacherous floods and disease-ridden marshes. But the papal plan prevailed, and the crusaders sailed southward from Acre, crossing the Mediterranean to the mouth of the Nile. The siege of Damietta began in May 1218. The city was strongly fortified, with massive walls and a key defensive tower known as the Chain Tower, which controlled access to the Nile. The Crusaders established a camp on the west bank of the river and began constructing siege engines. Among their most remarkable achievements was the building of a massive floating siege tower, mounted on ships and bristling with catapults, which they used to assault the Chain Tower. The first months of the siege were brutal. The Nile's waters, rising and falling with the seasons, complicated both sides' movements. Disease began to spread in the Crusader camp, and supplies became a constant concern. Yet, through persistence and innovation the Crusaders achieved a breakthrough. By August 1218, they captured the Chain Tower, opening the river to their ships and tightening the blockade of Damietta. Sultan al-Kamil, now fully aware of the threat, moved his forces into the delta to contain the Crusaders. The war turned into a stalemate of raids, counterattacks, and attrition. Al-Kamil even offered generous peace terms. He promised to return Jerusalem and large portions of the Holy Land if the Crusaders would abandon Egypt. but Cardinal Pelagius, seeing victory within reach, rejected the offer. This decision would later be remembered as one of the great missed opportunities of the crusading era. Throughout late 1218 and early 1219 the siege dragged on. Reinforcements continued to arrive, including a notable figure, Francis of Assisi, the humble Italian friar who would later be canonized as Saint Francis. He crossed enemy lines to meet with Sultan Al-Kamil, seeking to preach peace and perhaps convert the Sultan. Though no peace was achieved, the meeting became legendary as a moment of faith amidst war. By mid-1219, the Crusader army was a patchwork of nationalities, rivalries, and ambitions. John of Brienne advocated for practical negotiations, while Pelagius demanded total victory. The Nile floods, predictable yet devastating, trapped the Crusaders in their camp during the wet season. Many fell ill. Horses perished. Morale wavered, but the hope of a decisive conquest still held the army together. The first part of the Fifth Crusade thus closed with Damietta under siege, the Crusaders entrenched but divided, and Egypt bracing for a prolonged war. What began as a papal vision to strike at the heart of the Muslim world had turned into a grinding campaign in a hostile land, where the outcome remained far from certain. The siege of Damietta entered its second year as 1219 began. The Crusader army, a mix of French, German, Flemish, Austrian, and remnants of Hungarian forces, faced exhaustion, disease, and rising tensions. The initial enthusiasm that had brought them to Egypt began to erode. Supplies were inconsistent, and the marshy conditions of the Nile Delta took a constant toll. Yet the city still stood, defiant behind its walls and protected by the network of canals and waterways that surrounded it. Cardinal Pelagius, the papal legate, maintained firm control over the crusade strategy. He believed victory was ordained and that Damietta must be taken at any cost. John of Brienne, the titular king of Jerusalem, argued for a more cautious approach. He favored negotiations with Sultan Al-Kamil, who repeatedly offered terms of peace. Al-Kamil's offers were significant. He was willing to return Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and much of the kingdom of Jerusalem's former territory if the Crusaders would abandon their assault on Egypt. This offer caused deep debate in the Crusader camp. Many leaders, including John of Brienne, saw it as an extraordinary opportunity to achieve the very goal that had eluded the Crusaders for decades: the restoration of Jerusalem. But Cardinal Pelagius refused. He believed accepting the terms would betray the papal plan to subdue Egypt first and would display weakness. The refusal of this offer would later be remembered as a crucial turning point where diplomacy might have succeeded where war would fail. Through the summer of 1219, the siege continued. The Crusaders built new siege towers, dug trenches, and tightened their blockade. They received reinforcements from Europe, including a significant fleet from Italy. Inside the city, the defenders suffered from hunger and disease. Starvation spread and morale fell. By November 1219, after more than a year and a half of resistance, Damietta finally fell. The Crusaders stormed its walls, and the city was taken after bitter street fighting. Thousands of defenders and inhabitants were killed or enslaved. The fall of Damietta was celebrated across Christendom. Bells rang in Europe, and Pope Honorius III hailed it as a divine victory. But the triumph was not complete. The Crusaders now held a city, but they did not yet control Egypt. Moreover, their army was weakened, divided, and exhausted from the prolonged siege. The question arose: should they consolidate their hold on Damietta, or march further into Egypt? John of Brienne again urged caution. He argued for rebuilding the city's defenses, replenishing supplies, and negotiating a favorable exchange for Jerusalem. Sultan Al-Kamil, who had retreated to Cairo, continued to send envoys, renewing his offers to return the Holy City in exchange for Damietta. Once again, Cardinal Pelagius refused. Driven by papal authority and the belief that God had delivered Damietta into their hands as a sign of future conquest, he pushed for an advance on Cairo itself. The decision to march on Cairo was taken in mid-1221. By this time, the Crusader army was reorganized but far from its former strength. Many knights had returned home after fulfilling their vows. Disease continued to claim lives. Supplies were dependent on the Nile, and the Crusaders underestimated the seasonal flooding that could transform the Egyptian landscape into a trap. In July 1221, the Crusaders marched south from Damietta along the Nile. Their target was the city of Mansoura, a key point on the road to Cairo. Initially, their progress was steady. The Muslim forces under Al-Kamil shadowed them, avoiding direct battle but preparing the terrain. The Sultan ordered the opening of the Nile's irrigation canals, using the river's annual flood to their advantage. As the waters rose, the Crusaders found themselves trapped between the swollen Nile and the advancing Ayyubid army. The situation rapidly deteriorated. The Crusaders, burdened with heavy equipment, could not maneuver in the flooded terrain. Food supplies ran short and disease flared again. The heat of the Egyptian summer compounded their suffering. Al-Kamil, now reinforced by his brother Al-Muazzam from Syria, tightened the noose. Cut off from Damietta and surrounded by water and enemy forces, the Crusaders faced disaster. By late August 1221, they had no choice but to negotiate. The once proud army which had captured Damietta and dreamed of conquering Egypt, now sought terms of surrender. Al-Kamil dictated harsh but not vengeful terms. The Crusaders would return Damietta, evacuate Egypt, and agree to an 8-year truce. In exchange, their lives would be spared, and they would be allowed safe passage out of the country. Cardinal Pelagius, who had once rejected generous offers for the sake of total victory, was forced to accept humiliation. John of Brienne, though frustrated, worked to preserve what remained of the Crusader forces. In September 1221, the Crusaders evacuated Damietta and boarded their ships. Their great expedition had ended in failure, despite initial triumph. The Fifth Crusade thus concluded with little to show for years of effort. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. Egypt remained unconquered. The losses of men, money, and reputation were severe. In Europe, the Crusades' failure was blamed on poor leadership, especially the obstinacy of Cardinal Pelagius. Many criticized the papacy for overreaching its authority and ignoring the counsel of experienced secular leaders. For the Muslim world, the victory reinforced Egypt's central role in resisting Crusader ambitions. Al-Kamil's strategy of patience, combined with the natural power of the Nile, had triumphed over the numerically and technologically superior invaders. The failure of the Fifth Crusade also deepened divisions within Christendom. Kings had been reluctant to commit fully from the beginning, and their skepticism now seemed justified. The Crusade, however, left behind lessons that would shape future efforts. It demonstrated the importance of logistics, local geography, and diplomacy. It also marked one of the last major crusades directly organized and controlled by the papacy. Subsequent crusades, such as the Sixth led by Frederick II, would take different approaches, sometimes relying more on negotiation than outright war. In the Holy Land, the outcome was disappointing for the remaining Crusader states. Acre and the coastal enclaves continued to exist, but their hopes of restoring Jerusalem by force had again been dashed. The Crusaders' reliance on Egypt as the key to victory had backfired, and their disregard for local conditions had turned an initial success into a catastrophe. The Fifth Crusade also left its mark on the collective memory of Europe. Chroniclers recorded the suffering at Damietta, the negotiations spurned, and the shame of the final retreat. Pilgrims and merchants carried tales of the Nile floods and the wasted opportunity to recover Jerusalem. Among the common people, the idea of crusading began to lose some of its earlier glory. The dream of a swift and holy victory gave way to the reality of drawn-out campaigns, distant lands, and uncertain results. By the time the Crusaders returned home in late 1221 and early 1222, Europe had moved on. New political struggles emerged, and the papacy began planning future expeditions. The memory of the Fifth Crusade faded behind the horizon of coming events. The Sixth Crusade under Frederick II, the Seventh under Louis IX, and the gradual decline of Crusader power in the Levant. Yet, in the sands of Egypt and the waters of the Nile, the Fifth Crusade left a lasting lesson. Faith and zeal alone could not overcome strategic miscalculation, environmental challenges, and the refusal to seize peace when it was within reach. It was a campaign that began with high hopes, achieved a dramatic victory at Damietta, and ended in retreat, marking another chapter of frustration in the long history of the crusading movement. The Sixth Crusade was unlike any that came before it. It was not marked by grand armies marching across continents in a blaze of religious fury, nor by the clashing of great forces on open battlefields. Instead, it unfolded in an era when politics, diplomacy, and the ambition of a single man reshaped the destiny of the Holy Land. That man was Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, a ruler as brilliant as he was controversial. By the time the Fifth Crusade had ended in failure in 1221, the Christian world was exhausted and disillusioned. The loss at Damietta, the flooding of the Nile, and the humiliating withdrawal from Egypt had left a deep scar on European Christendom. Yet the desire to reclaim Jerusalem had not vanished. The Pope, now Honorius III and later his successor Pope Gregory IX, looked for a leader who could revive the crusading spirit. That leader was meant to be Frederick II, a man whose very birth had been marked by Crusader vows. Frederick II was born in 1194, the son of Henry VI and the grandson of Frederick Barbarossa, the famed emperor who had perished on the way to the Third Crusade. Raised in the multicultural court of Sicily, Frederick grew into a man of immense intellect and curiosity. He spoke several languages including Latin, German, Italian and Arabic, and surrounded himself with scholars, poets and scientists. To some he was the ideal Christian monarch, educated, visionary and ambitious. To others he was dangerously independent, often at odds with the papacy and the traditional powers of Christendom. In 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, Frederick had taken the cross and vowed to lead a crusade to the Holy Land. But years passed and the promise remained unfulfilled. His coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 1220 only increased papal expectations. Pope Honorius III repeatedly urged him to depart, but Frederick delayed, citing unrest in his territories, political entanglements and the need for preparation. The papacy grew impatient, and when Honorius died in 1227, the new pope, Gregory IX, was far less tolerant. By this time the Muslim world was also changing. The great warrior Saladin had died in 1193, and the Ayyubid dynasty he left behind was fractured by rivalries between his heirs. Egypt and Syria, the two great pillars of his empire, were often at odds. In Egypt, Al-Kamil ruled as sultan, while in Syria his brother Al-Muazzam held power. These divisions would later shape Frederick's opportunity. In 1227, after more than a decade of delays, Frederick finally set sail from Brindisi, leading a crusading host toward the east. But almost immediately disaster struck. An outbreak of plague or dysentery ravaged the fleet, killing many and forcing Frederick himself to turn back to Italy due to illness. This enraged Pope Gregory IX, who saw yet another excuse. Convinced that Frederick was deceiving Christendom, the Pope excommunicated him, declaring that the Holy Roman Emperor was cut off from the Church. This excommunication placed Frederick in a unique position. He was a crusader forbidden from the sacraments, a leader of Christendom cast out by its spiritual head. But rather than abandon his vow, Frederick resolved to continue. He believed that his imperial authority and divine mission did not rest upon papal approval. In 1228 he set sail again, this time with fewer troops but greater determination. When Frederick arrived in the Levant, he faced a complex situation. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had been without a strong king for decades. Its territories were reduced to coastal enclaves, Acre, Tyre, and a few fortresses, and its nobility was riven by factions. Some welcomed Frederick as the long-awaited savior. Others distrusted him, fearing that his conflict with the Pope would bring ruin. Instead of marching immediately to war, Frederick began with diplomacy. He understood that the Ayyubid rulers were divided. Al-Kamil of Egypt was at odds with his brother Al-Muazzam in Syria. The emperor opened secret negotiations with Al-Kamil, using his knowledge of Arabic and his envoys to offer peace rather than conquest. This was an extraordinary move, for it suggested that the Sixth Crusade might be won not by the sword but by the treaty. While these negotiations unfolded, Frederick took control of Acre and asserted his authority over the Crusader States. His presence was controversial. He was excommunicated, yet he wore the cross and spoke of liberating Jerusalem. The papal legate, representing Gregory IX, refused to support him, and some of the local barons resented his imperial interference. Still, Frederick pressed on, using his political skill rather than brute force. The emperor also found himself in a strange position with the military orders. The Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller were wary of his leadership, seeing him as too independent of the Church. Only the Teutonic Knights, a newer and more Germanic order, offered him clear support. This division among the Christian forces would shape the events to come. In Egypt, meanwhile, Al-Kamil faced his own pressures. His brother Al-Muazzam died in 1227, leaving Damascus in a state of uncertainty. With his rival gone, Al-Kamil now ruled a more united Ayyubid realm, but he also feared renewed conflict from his other relatives. War with Frederick might strengthen his enemies, peace could buy him time. Moreover, Al-Kamil was a pragmatist. He had seen the disasters of the Fifth Crusade and knew that the Christian powers, though divided, could still pose a threat if united. By early 1229, negotiations had reached their climax. Frederick, without launching a major campaign, had persuaded Al-Kamil to consider a peaceful settlement. The terms were unprecedented. Jerusalem, Bethlehem and Nazareth would be returned to Christian control, but the city's sacred sites, the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, would remain under Muslim administration. The walls of Jerusalem, largely destroyed since Saladin's conquest, would not be rebuilt, and the Muslims would retain their hold over the surrounding countryside. This arrangement shocked many. A crusade without bloodshed, a holy city gained by words rather than war, seemed both miraculous and suspect. The Pope, still furious at Frederick's defiance, refused to recognize his achievements. Many crusaders felt cheated of their chance for glory, while others saw it as a triumph of reason over slaughter. Before this treaty could be signed, however, Frederick faced constant intrigue. Some barons plotted against him, the papal legate denounced him, and rumors swirled that the Pope would launch a crusade not against the Muslims but against Frederick himself. The emperor, ever the schemer, used both threats and promises to maintain control. He held a coronation ceremony in Jerusalem in 1229, placing the crown upon his own head in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for no bishop would crown and excommunicate emperor. This act symbolized the entire nature of the Sixth Crusade, a war waged without papal blessing, a crusade fulfilled by diplomacy, and an emperor who stood alone between two worlds, Christian and Muslim, Pope and Sultan, war and peace. The Sixth Crusade entered its defining moment in early 1229, not with the thunder of armies but with the scratching of pens upon parchment. The negotiations between Emperor Frederick II and Sultan Al-Kamil of Egypt had matured into a draft treaty that would reshape the balance of power in the Holy Land for years to come. Known later as the Treaty of Jaffa, it represented one of the most unusual episodes in the history of the Crusades, a peaceful restoration of Jerusalem to Christian hands, achieved without a single major battle. The terms of the treaty were complex and reflected the pragmatism of both sides. Jerusalem itself, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and most of the city proper, was to be handed over to the Christians. Bethlehem and Nazareth, two other sacred sites of immense importance, would also be returned. However, the city's fortifications were not to be rebuilt, leaving it militarily weak. The surrounding countryside, including key fortresses, would remain under Muslim control, ensuring that the city could not easily become a springboard for renewed Crusader offensives. The Temple Mount, home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, would stay under Islamic administration, and Muslims would retain the right to worship there freely. This clause was of great importance to Al-Kamil, for it preserved the sanctity of Islam's third holiest site. Christians, for their part, regained access to the holy places they had longed to see since Saladin's victory more than 40 years earlier. For Frederick, this treaty was a triumph of diplomacy and timing. He had achieved through negotiation what 4 previous crusades had failed to secure by war. His reputation as a man of intellect and strategy grew, though not necessarily his popularity. Many among the crusading host were bewildered, even resentful. They had taken the cross expecting battle, plunder, and the heroic retaking of Jerusalem by force. Instead, they found themselves witness to a peaceful handover, brokered by an emperor who was still excommunicated by the Pope. In February 1229, Frederick entered Jerusalem. The city was quiet, its streets lined with curious onlookers. There were no triumphant processions, no roaring crowds, and no pope or patriarch to bless his entry. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most sacred site in Christendom, became the stage for an extraordinary and controversial act. On March 18, 1229, Frederick crowned himself King of Jerusalem. No bishop officiated, no papal legate approved. He placed the crown upon his own head, declaring himself ruler of the city by right of his marriage to Isabella II, the heiress of Jerusalem, and by the authority of the treaty he had signed. This self-coronation outraged many. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, Gerald of Lausanne, refused to attend and denounced the ceremony as illegitimate. Pope Gregory IX, upon hearing of it, only deepened his hostility toward the emperor. In the eyes of the papacy, Frederick was a rebel who had dared to act as God's agent without the blessing of the Church. Despite this, Frederick attempted to govern Jerusalem with a measure of fairness. He guaranteed freedom of worship for Muslims and Christians alike, honored the terms of the treaty with Al-Kamil, and sought to restore some measure of stability to the Crusader States. But his position was fragile. The Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, the two most powerful military orders, remained cold toward him. Only the Teutonic Knights, with their German roots, offered loyalty. Moreover, the treaty itself had deep flaws. Without fortifications, Jerusalem was vulnerable to attack. Its surrounding lands were in Muslim hands, meaning that any future conflict would threaten its survival. Many barons of the Crusader States considered the arrangement a temporary truce at best, not a lasting peace. Meanwhile, in Europe, Pope Gregory IX launched an open campaign against Frederick. He declared that the emperor's actions in the Holy Land were a sham, that his treaty with the Muslims was a betrayal of Christendom, and that he remained excommunicated. In 1229, papal forces even invaded Frederick's territories in southern Italy, sparking what became known as the War of the Keys. This conflict between Pope and Emperor would overshadow the aftermath of the Sixth Crusade and poison relations between them for years to come. Frederick, learning of the papal invasion, realized he could not remain in the Holy Land. Though he had achieved his goal, his grip on the region was tenuous, and his empire in Europe demanded his presence. In May 1229 he departed from Acre, leaving behind a fragile kingdom and a bitterly divided nobility. His departure marked the beginning of the slow unraveling of his achievements. Though the treaty was set for 10 years, the lack of unity among the Crusaders and the continued hostility of the papacy left Jerusalem exposed. Muslim leaders in Syria and Egypt watched the situation closely, knowing that the city's weak defenses and Christian infighting would eventually invite reconquest. Frederick himself, however, returned to Italy as a man both triumphant and embattled. He had done what no other Crusader leader had managed since the days of the First Crusade. He had restored Jerusalem, albeit briefly, without a single pitched battle. Yet his success brought him no peace. The Pope still regarded him as an enemy, the Church denounced his methods, and his name was cursed in sermons even as it was praised in some courts of Europe. In the Holy Land, the aftermath of his crusade was equally paradoxical. Pilgrims returned to Jerusalem, monks and priests restored their shrines, and for a brief time the bells of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre rang once more. But the city's Christians knew their hold was fragile. They lacked the manpower to defend it, the fortifications to withstand a siege, and the unity to act decisively should war return. The Sixth Crusade, in the end, became a symbol of the changing nature of the crusading movement. No longer was the crusade solely a matter of armies and sieges. It had become a stage for diplomacy, politics, and the ambitions of kings and emperors. Frederick too had shown that treaties could achieve what swords could not, but he had also shown how fleeting such victories could be when they lacked broad support. Within 15 years of his departure, Jerusalem would fall again to Muslim forces, this time under the Khwarezmians and later the Ayyubid rulers of Egypt. The dream of a lasting Christian kingdom in the Holy Land would fade further with each passing decade. Yet the Sixth Crusade left a legacy. It revealed the weaknesses of the papal crusading model, demonstrated the potential of negotiation, and highlighted the growing tensions between secular rulers and the papacy. For Frederick, it was a moment of glory that only deepened his conflict with the Church and foreshadowed the struggles of his later reign. As he rode away from the Holy Land in 1229, the sun setting behind the towers of Acre, Frederick too could claim that he had fulfilled his vow. He had taken the cross, gone to Jerusalem, and restored it to Christendom. But he had done so in his own way, by wit rather than war, by diplomacy rather than devotion, and for that history would remember his crusade as both a success and a scandal. In the year 1244, Jerusalem once again fell into the hands of Muslim forces after a brief period of Christian control. The shock of this event echoed across Europe, reigniting calls for a new crusade to reclaim the Holy City and to reaffirm Christian power in the Levant. Among those who felt the strongest compulsion to act was King Louis IX of France, a deeply pious monarch whose sense of duty to God shaped his rule. His reign had already been marked by devotion, charity, and a strong moral compass, but now he felt called to take the cross and lead Christendom into another holy expedition. Louis IX had suffered a severe illness in 1244, one that nearly claimed his life. During this period of weakness and uncertainty, he vowed that if he recovered, he would dedicate his strength to the cause of Christ and the liberation of the Holy Land. Upon his miraculous recovery, he considered this vow sacred and unbreakable. Thus, preparations for what would become the Seventh Crusade began. Pope Innocent IV, who had called for renewed crusading fervor, supported Louis's ambition. However, Europe was no longer as united or as eager for war as it had been during the earlier Crusades. The disasters of the Fifth and Sixth Crusades, the loss of Jerusalem, and the ongoing struggles between European monarchs and the papacy had left many skeptical of large-scale military campaigns in the East. Yet, Louis's personal piety, political influence, and the prestige of the French crown ensured that significant support would rally to his side. By 1248, Louis IX had secured papal blessing, raised substantial funds, and assembled a considerable force. The composition of his army reflected the evolving nature of crusading warfare. Heavily armored knights from France, contingents from neighboring kingdoms, professional soldiers, and a large number of non-combatants including priests, artisans, and merchants. Louis also made arrangements for a massive fleet, understanding that control of the Mediterranean routes would be essential for any successful campaign. Unlike many of his predecessors, Louis IX approached the crusade with meticulous planning. He negotiated with other European rulers to ensure the stability of France during his absence. His mother, Blanche of Castile, would act as regent, maintaining royal authority while he was away. He also secured loans, reorganized taxes, and even sought alliances that could potentially benefit the expedition. One striking aspect of Louis's preparations was his insistence on discipline among the Crusaders. He forbade looting, ordered fair treatment of local populations, and tried to reduce the excesses that had plagued earlier campaigns. The choice of target for the Seventh Crusade was crucial. Rather than marching directly to Jerusalem, Louis and his advisors decided to first strike at Egypt. The rationale behind this decision was both strategic and historical. Egypt, under the rule of the Ayyubid dynasty, was the richest and most powerful Muslim state in the region. By capturing Egypt, the Crusaders could cut off vital support lines to Jerusalem, secure immense wealth, and establish a base for further operations in the Holy Land. This was the same strategy that had been attempted during the Fifth Crusade, and despite its failure, Louis believed that with better leadership and divine favor, it could now succeed. In August 1248, the Crusader fleet departed from France and made its way to Cyprus. The island had long served as a staging ground for crusading operations, and it was here that Louis finalized his plans, gathered additional supplies, and waited for reinforcements. Cyprus was strategically located and offered a safe harbor where the Crusaders could train and organize without the immediate threat of Muslim counterattacks. The months spent on Cyprus were marked by both spiritual preparation and military drills. Louis encouraged sermons, masses, and confessions among his troops, fostering a sense of holy purpose. He also consulted military engineers and advisors, refining siege tactics and logistics. The target of the initial assault was determined: Damietta, a key port city on the Nile Delta, which had been a focal point in previous crusades. Capturing Damietta would provide the Crusaders with a gateway into Egypt and a stronghold from which to launch deeper incursions. In June 1249, the Crusader fleet set sail from Cyprus and landed near Damietta. This moment marked the true beginning of the Seventh Crusade's military campaign. The landing was well executed, and the Egyptian garrison, perhaps underestimating the size and determination of the crusading force, offered limited resistance at first. The Crusaders established a beachhead and began their assault on the city. The capture of Damietta was swift and surprisingly successful. Within days, the city fell into Christian hands, much like it had during the Fifth Crusade years earlier. The victory was celebrated as a sign of divine favor. Louis IX entered the city not as a conqueror bent on plunder, but as a ruler seeking to establish just governance. He forbade looting, protected the Muslim civilians who remained, and ordered the rebuilding of key defenses to secure the city against counterattacks. This early triumph, however, sowed the seeds of overconfidence. Many Crusaders believed that Egypt would soon collapse entirely, and that Jerusalem would fall like a ripe fruit into Christian hands. Yet the true challenges of the Nile Delta were only beginning to reveal themselves. The hot, humid climate was harsh on the European soldiers, disease spread quickly in the camps, and supply lines were stretched thin. Meanwhile, the Egyptian Sultan al-Salih Ayyub, though initially caught off guard, began to muster his forces. Reinforcements were sent, and strategies were drawn to cut off the Crusaders from advancing further into the heart of Egypt. The Nile's complex system of waterways, floodplains, and canals became both a natural barrier and a weapon in the hands of the defenders. Louis IX, determined to press his advantage, convened his war council to plan the next phase of the campaign. His ultimate goal was Cairo, the beating heart of Egypt's wealth and administration. If Cairo could be taken, the entire region would fall under Crusader control, and negotiations for Jerusalem would follow on terms favorable to Christendom. But advancing from Damietta to Cairo was no simple task. The distance itself was not great, but the terrain was treacherous. The Nile's seasonal floods could turn dry ground into impassable marshes, and the Egyptians knew how to manipulate these waters to their advantage. Moreover, the longer the Crusaders delayed, the more time they gave their enemies to regroup and counterattack. Despite warnings from some of his advisors to consolidate his gains and wait for better conditions, Louis pushed forward. His faith and his sense of destiny drove him to believe that hesitation would squander the opportunity given by God. The Crusader army began its march along the Nile, setting the stage for one of the most challenging and disastrous phases of the entire crusading era. The first leg of the march was marked by a mixture of optimism and growing hardship. Supplies dwindled, the summer heat intensified, and morale began to waver. Egyptian forces harassed the Crusader flanks, using hit-and-run tactics and the terrain to slow their advance. Skirmishes broke out, and each minor encounter reminded the Europeans that their victory at Damietta was only the beginning, not the end, of their struggle. Yet Louis remained steadfast. He continued to hold councils of war, prayed with his soldiers, and offered assurances that God's favor had not abandoned them. His leadership, marked by both courage and stubbornness, kept the army moving forward even as the signs of looming disaster multiplied. By the end of 1249, the Crusaders were deep in the Nile Delta, facing the fortified city of Mansurah, a key defensive point on the road to Cairo. Here the Egyptian forces had entrenched themselves, determined to halt the invaders at any cost. The stage was set for the next and most perilous chapter of the Seventh Crusade, where the dreams of a pious king would clash with the realities of war, nature, and politics in a land that had resisted Christian conquest time and again. The fall of Damietta had given the Crusaders an intoxicating sense of triumph. They believed that Egypt was theirs for the taking, and through Egypt the Holy Land would once more bow to the cross. Yet this sense of overconfidence soon turned into a dangerous burden. King Louis IX, encouraged by early success, delayed the advance toward Cairo. His army lingered too long in the captured port, waiting for reinforcements and supplies that trickled in slowly. Summer heat, Nile floods, and the spread of disease weakened his forces before the true march had even begun. By late 1249, the French king ordered his army to march southward toward the Egyptian heartland. The plan was simple in design but perilous in execution: follow the Nile's course, capture key strongholds, and force the Sultan to surrender. The Sultan at the time, Al-Salih Ayyub, had died in the midst of the campaign, leaving Egypt in a moment of uncertainty. His widow, Shajar al-Dur, a formidable and intelligent woman, concealed his death for weeks to avoid panic and chaos. Behind the curtain of secrecy, she coordinated with commanders like Fakhr al-Din and the capable young general, Baybars. Their strategy was not to meet the Crusaders in open battle at once but to use the Nile's natural geography to their advantage. The Crusader army, numbering tens of thousands, advanced toward the town of Mansurah in early 1250. The march was arduous. The river's banks were flooded in parts, turning fields into swamps. The army's supply lines stretched thin, their horses sank in mud, and disease began to claim men daily. Despite these obstacles, the Crusaders pressed on, driven by their king's fervor and a belief that God had chosen him as the deliverer of Jerusalem. At Mansurah, the stage was set for the decisive confrontation. The city was heavily fortified, and the Egyptian army had fortified the approaches with canals and hidden traps. Baybars, taking command of the defense, used a clever tactic. He allowed the Crusaders to cross a branch of the Nile via a hidden ford, luring them into a narrow approach. On February 8, 1250, the vanguard of the Crusader army, led by Robert of Artois, Louis's brother, launched a bold assault. Against the advice of more experienced commanders, Robert charged ahead with the Templars and English forces, entering the city prematurely. The result was a massacre. The streets turned into a killing ground where arrows, boiling oil, and sword strikes decimated the Crusader vanguard. Robert of Artois was killed in the chaos, and the survivors fled back to the main army with grim tales of disaster. The Battle of Mansurah had begun. For weeks, fierce fighting raged in the marshes and canals around the city. King Louis IX personally commanded his forces, displaying courage and calm amidst disaster, but the logistical nightmare grew worse. Supplies were cut off, the Nile's waters rose unpredictably, and dysentery spread like wildfire. Horses died by the hundreds, and knights who had once ridden in glory now trudged through mud in despair. The Egyptians, reinvigorated under Baybars and soon by the arrival of the new Sultan, Turanshah, stepson of Al-Salih, pressed their advantage. They set fire to Crusader camps, launched night raids and slowly tightened the noose around Louis's army. Negotiations for peace faltered, as the Crusaders still demanded too much, while their bargaining position grew weaker by the day. By April 1250, the Crusader army attempted a desperate retreat toward Damietta. It was a harrowing march, with men collapsing from hunger and disease, and Egyptian forces striking at their flanks. At the village of Fariscour, the retreat turned into a rout. Surrounded and cut off from the river, the Crusaders surrendered en masse. King Louis IX, the Holy King who had crossed the sea to reclaim the Holy Land, was taken prisoner, an event that shocked Christendom. The capture of a reigning European monarch was unprecedented in the Crusades. Louis was treated with respect, but his captivity became a tool for Egyptian negotiation. The terms of his release were harsh: the Crusaders had to pay an enormous ransom of 800,000 bezants and surrender Damietta, the very city that had symbolized their early triumph. Louis, though humiliated, accepted the terms. He and his surviving army were released in May 1250, marking the inglorious end of the Egyptian campaign. Yet, the Seventh Crusade did not end with Louis's release. Instead of returning immediately to France, the pious king chose to remain in the Holy Land for 4 more years, from 1250 to 1254. He resided in Acre, attempting to strengthen Christian fortifications, negotiate with local lords, and form alliances with the Mongols and other powers. His presence provided temporary stability to the Crusader States, but no great victories followed. The glow of his early zeal had dimmed, and the once mighty host that had landed with him was now a shadow of its former strength. Meanwhile, in Europe, the failure of the Crusade sowed disappointment and criticism. Many nobles and commoners questioned the wisdom of waging war in distant lands while their own territories suffered taxation and neglect. The papacy, which had supported Louis's endeavor, found itself on the defensive as faith in grand crusading ventures began to wane. For the Muslim world, the Seventh Crusade marked a turning point. The leadership of Shajar al-Dur and the rise of commanders like Baybars showcased a new generation of capable leaders. Within a few years, Baybars would ascend to become Sultan of Egypt and one of the fiercest defenders of Islam against both Crusaders and Mongols. The Egyptian victory at Mansurah emboldened the Ayyubid remnants and laid the groundwork for Mamluk dominance in the region. As for King Louis IX, his failure in Egypt did not diminish his personal piety or reputation as a devout monarch. He returned to France in 1254, greeted as both a penitent and a hero despite the disaster. His sense of mission, however, remained unbroken. 2 decades later he would launch yet another crusade, the Eighth Crusade, which would also end in failure, this time costing him his life. The Seventh Crusade, therefore, stood as a testament to the perils of overconfidence, poor logistics, and underestimating local resistance. It was a campaign that began with the promise of divine favor and ended with the humiliation of a king in chains. The rivers of Egypt, the walls of Mansurah, and the fetid swamps of the Nile had claimed yet another generation of crusaders, leaving behind ruins where once there had been dreams of conquest. For the people of the Crusader States, the aftermath was bittersweet. They had gained a brief reprieve with Louis's support, but the loss of manpower and resources made them increasingly vulnerable to future attacks. The Muslim forces, now hardened and united, would soon turn their eyes again toward the remaining Christian strongholds. As the sun set over the eastern Mediterranean in 1254, King Louis IX boarded a ship to return to his homeland. His crusading vow remained technically unfulfilled, and his heart still yearned for Jerusalem. Yet the cost, in blood, treasure, and broken lives, had been immense. The Seventh Crusade faded into history as a somber reminder that faith alone, without strategy and adaptability, could not overcome the realities of geography, disease, and determined resistance. The fall of Damietta had given the Crusaders an intoxicating sense of triumph. They believed that Egypt was theirs for the taking, and through Egypt the Holy Land would once more bow to the cross. Yet this sense of overconfidence soon turned into a dangerous burden. King Louis IX, encouraged by early success, delayed the advance toward Cairo. His army lingered too long in the captured port, waiting for reinforcements and supplies that trickled in slowly. Summer heat, Nile floods, and the spread of disease weakened his forces before the true march had even begun. By late 1249, the French king ordered his army to march southward toward the Egyptian heartland. The plan was simple in design but perilous in execution: follow the Nile's course, capture key strongholds, and force the Sultan to surrender. The Sultan at the time, Al-Salih Ayyub, had died in the midst of the campaign, leaving Egypt in a moment of uncertainty. His widow, Shajar al-Dur, a formidable and intelligent woman, concealed his death for weeks to avoid panic and chaos. Behind the curtain of secrecy, she coordinated with commanders like Fakhr al-Din and the capable young general, Baybars. Their strategy was not to meet the Crusaders in open battle at once but to use the Nile's natural geography to their advantage. The Crusader army, numbering tens of thousands, advanced toward the town of Mansurah in early 1250. The march was arduous. The river's banks were flooded in parts, turning fields into swamps. The army's supply lines stretched thin, their horses sank in mud, and disease began to claim men daily. Despite these obstacles, the Crusaders pressed on, driven by their king's fervor and a belief that God had chosen him as the deliverer of Jerusalem. At Mansurah, the stage was set for the decisive confrontation. The city was heavily fortified, and the Egyptian army had fortified the approaches with canals and hidden traps. Baybars, taking command of the defense, used a clever tactic. He allowed the Crusaders to cross a branch of the Nile via a hidden ford, luring them into a narrow approach. On February 8, 1250, the vanguard of the Crusader army, led by Robert of Artois, Louis's brother, launched a bold assault. Against the advice of more experienced commanders, Robert charged ahead with the Templars and English forces, entering the city prematurely. The result was a massacre. The streets turned into a killing ground where arrows, boiling oil, and sword strikes decimated the Crusader vanguard. Robert of Artois was killed in the chaos, and the survivors fled back to the main army with grim tales of disaster. The Battle of Mansourah had begun. For weeks, fierce fighting raged in the marshes and canals around the city. King Louis IX personally commanded his forces, displaying courage and calm amidst disaster, but the logistical nightmare grew worse. Supplies were cut off, the Nile's waters rose unpredictably, and dysentery spread like wildfire. Horses died by the hundreds, and knights who had once ridden in glory now trudged through mud in despair. The Egyptians, reinvigorated under Baybars and soon by the arrival of the new sultan, Turanshah, stepson of al-Salih, pressed their advantage. They set fire to Crusader camps, launched night raids and slowly tightened the noose around Louis's army. Negotiations for peace faltered, as the Crusaders still demanded too much, while their bargaining position grew weaker by the day. By April 1250, the Crusader army attempted a desperate retreat toward Damietta. It was a harrowing march, with men collapsing from hunger and disease, and Egyptian forces striking at their flanks. At the village of Fariscour, the retreat turned into a rout. Surrounded and cut off from the river, the Crusaders surrendered en masse. King Louis IX, the Holy King who had crossed the sea to reclaim the Holy Land, was taken prisoner, an event that shocked Christendom. The capture of a reigning European monarch was unprecedented in the Crusades. Louis was treated with respect, but his captivity became a tool for Egyptian negotiation. The terms of his release were harsh. The Crusaders had to pay an enormous ransom of 800,000 bezants and surrender Damietta, the very city that had symbolized their early triumph. Louis, though humiliated, accepted the terms. He and his surviving army were released in May 1250, marking the inglorious end of the Egyptian campaign. Yet, the Seventh Crusade did not end with Louis's release. Instead of returning immediately to France, the pious king chose to remain in the Holy Land for 4 more years, from 1250 to 1254. He resided in Acre, attempting to strengthen Christian fortifications, negotiate with local lords, and form alliances with the Mongols and other powers. His presence provided temporary stability to the Crusader States, but no great victories followed. The glow of his early zeal had dimmed, and the once mighty host that had landed with him was now a shadow of its former strength. Meanwhile, in Europe, the failure of the Crusade sowed disappointment and criticism. Many nobles and commoners questioned the wisdom of waging war in distant lands while their own territories suffered taxation and neglect. The papacy, which had supported Louis's endeavor, found itself on the defensive as faith in grand crusading ventures began to wane. For the Muslim world, the Seventh Crusade marked a turning point. The leadership of Shajar al-Dur and the rise of commanders like Baybars showcased a new generation of capable leaders. Within a few years, Baybars would ascend to become Sultan of Egypt and one of the fiercest defenders of Islam against both Crusaders and Mongols. The Egyptian victory at Mansourah emboldened the Ayyubid remnants and laid the groundwork for Mamluk dominance in the region. As for King Louis IX, his failure in Egypt did not diminish his personal piety or reputation as a devout monarch. He returned to France in 1254, greeted as both a penitent and a hero despite the disaster. His sense of mission, however, remained unbroken. 2 decades later he would launch yet another crusade, the Eighth Crusade, which would also end in failure, this time costing him his life. The Seventh Crusade, therefore, stood as a testament to the perils of overconfidence, poor logistics and underestimating local resistance. It was a campaign that began with the promise of divine favor and ended with the humiliation of a king in chains. The rivers of Egypt, the walls of Mansourah and the fetid swamps of the Nile had claimed yet another generation of crusaders, leaving behind ruins where once there had been dreams of conquest. For the people of the Crusader States, the aftermath was bittersweet. They had gained a brief reprieve with Louis's support, but the loss of manpower and resources made them increasingly vulnerable to future attacks. The Muslim forces, now hardened and united, would soon turn their eyes again toward the remaining Christian strongholds. As the sun set over the eastern Mediterranean in 1254, King Louis IX boarded a ship to return to his homeland. His crusading vow remained technically unfulfilled, and his heart still yearned for Jerusalem. Yet the cost, in blood, treasure and broken lives, had been immense. The Seventh Crusade faded into history as a somber reminder that faith alone, without strategy and adaptability, could not overcome the realities of geography, disease and determined resistance. The Eighth Crusade stands as one of the most curious and controversial expeditions of the medieval crusading era. It was neither marked by triumphant victories nor by ambitious conquests in the Holy Land. Instead, it became a journey defined by miscalculations, shifting political priorities, and the tragic death of one of Christendom's most devout kings, Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis. After the disastrous conclusion of the Seventh Crusade in Egypt, 1248 to 1254, where Louis himself had been captured and ransomed, the idea of another crusade might have seemed a distant dream. Yet, for Louis IX, the vow he had once taken to serve the cross was not something to be easily set aside. The Eighth Crusade was born not out of strategic necessity in the Holy Land but from a mixture of religious zeal, political influence, and the complex web of Mediterranean power struggles. In the years following the Seventh Crusade, the Crusader States in the Levant, remnants of the old Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, were in a fragile state. The great coastal cities such as Acre, Tyre and Tripoli remained under Christian control, but their position was precarious. Muslim power in the region was divided but gradually consolidating, particularly under the Mamluks in Egypt, who had risen to prominence after overthrowing the Ayyubid dynasty. Meanwhile, the Mongol Empire's westward expansions and their occasional overtures to Christian powers had created a sense that perhaps a new alliance could be forged to challenge the Muslim strongholds in the Near East. But Europe itself was fragmented, weary of long and costly expeditions, and increasingly preoccupied with its own internal rivalries. By the late 1260s, Louis IX, now older and deeply pious, resolved once again to take up the cross. His previous failure in Egypt had been a humiliation, but in his mind, it had also been an unfinished task, a penance yet to be completed. What made the Eighth Crusade unusual, however, was its chosen target. Instead of marching directly toward Jerusalem or the coastal Levant, Louis planned to sail to North Africa, specifically to Tunis. This choice was influenced by several factors. First, Louis believed that the ruler of Tunis, Muhammad I al-Mustansir, might be persuaded, or pressured, to convert to Christianity, thereby creating a new ally in the region. Second, his brother Charles of Anjou, who had established himself as king of Sicily after defeating the Hohenstaufens, had significant political and economic interests in the central Mediterranean. A crusade to Tunis would not only satisfy Louis's religious vow but also serve the strategic ambitions of his Angevin brother. Preparations for the crusade began in earnest in the late 1260s. Louis IX called upon the great lords of France and beyond to join him once more in a holy venture. However, enthusiasm was far more muted than in the early days of the First or even the Third Crusade. Many European monarchs were embroiled in their own affairs. England was dealing with internal strife under King Henry III, the Holy Roman Empire was fragmented, and the Iberian kingdoms were focused on the Reconquista against Muslim forces in Spain. The papacy, under Clement IV, gave its blessing, but the broader support network of Christendom was far less enthusiastic than in previous generations. Still, Louis persisted, using his personal fortune, royal revenues and diplomatic pressure to assemble a fleet and an army. By 1270 the Crusader host was ready to depart. Estimates vary, but the army was likely smaller than the force that had marched to Egypt 2 decades earlier, perhaps numbering around 15,000 to 20,000 soldiers, along with knights, clerics, artisans and non-combatants. They gathered in the ports of southern France, particularly at Aigues-Mortes, the fortified harbor constructed during the Seventh Crusade. The fleet consisted of hundreds of ships, carrying not only men but also supplies, siege equipment and the royal household. The mood among the participants was one of mixed anticipation and apprehension. Many remembered the hardships of the last expedition, and rumors circulated about the true objectives of this journey. The voyage began in July 1270. The fleet set sail across the Mediterranean, first stopping at Sardinia and then proceeding toward the African coast. Unlike previous crusades that aimed directly for Egypt or the Levant, the Eighth Crusade made landfall near Carthage, close to the city of Tunis. This decision baffled some of the Crusaders, who had expected to head for Acre or even Cairo. However, Louis remained steadfast in his plan. His idea was to establish a strong Christian base in North Africa that could then be used as a springboard for future campaigns in the Holy Land. He also believed that the ruler of Tunis might be coerced through military pressure to negotiate terms favorable to Christendom. The landing near Tunis in late July 1270 was initially unopposed. The Crusaders quickly occupied the old ruins of Carthage, which still bore the marks of its ancient past, and began constructing a fortified camp. Supplies were unloaded, and the army prepared for a possible siege. The summer heat, however, was oppressive, and the surrounding region offered little in the way of fresh water or suitable provisions. This would soon prove to be one of the most critical challenges of the campaign. In the first weeks after their arrival, the Crusaders attempted to establish contact with the local ruler, Al-Mustansir. Rather than seeking immediate open battle, Louis hoped to use a combination of diplomacy and intimidation to bring him to the negotiating table. Envoys were sent, messages were exchanged, but the Sultan of Tunis had little intention of capitulating to this foreign host. He instead began gathering his forces, harassing the Crusader positions and cutting off their access to supplies. Skirmishes broke out in the surrounding countryside, but no decisive engagement occurred at this early stage. As the Crusaders fortified their position, disease began to spread in the camp. The sweltering North African summer, combined with poor sanitation and a lack of fresh food and water, created the perfect conditions for dysentery, typhoid, and other illnesses. Soldiers began falling ill in alarming numbers, and the morale of the army began to falter. Still, Louis held firm. He organized prayers, processions, and religious ceremonies, believing that their suffering was a test of faith and that perseverance would bring divine favor. Meanwhile, the broader political landscape was shifting. Charles of Anjou, the King of Sicily and brother to Louis, had not initially departed with the main fleet but was expected to join the Crusaders soon. His arrival was crucial, for he held both the naval power and the regional influence to make the Tunisian campaign viable. Charles, however, had his own motives. His Sicilian kingdom had commercial and political interests in North Africa, and a subjugated or allied Tunis would greatly benefit his Mediterranean ambitions. For him, the crusade was as much an opportunity for expansion as it was an act of piety. By mid-August, the situation in the Crusader camp had become dire. The heat showed no sign of relenting, and the diseases claimed more lives with each passing day. Even high-ranking nobles and knights succumbed to the illness, their strength sapped before any major battle had even begun. Louis IX himself, known for his personal austerity and devout practices, insisted on remaining in the midst of his suffering army rather than retreating to the safety of the ships. He attended to the sick, participated in prayers, and continued to hope for reinforcements and a divine turn of fortune. The arrival of Charles of Anjou in late August brought both hope and complexity. His fleet landed with fresh troops and supplies, boosting the Crusader numbers and temporarily stabilizing the situation. However, his presence also shifted the dynamics of command. Charles was a shrewd and ambitious ruler, less interested in Louis's spiritual vision of a redeemed North Africa and more focused on practical gains. He advocated for harsher measures against Tunis, including full-scale assaults and tighter blockades, but the weakened condition of the army made such actions risky. At this stage, the Eighth Crusade had yet to achieve any of its stated goals. The city of Tunis remained defiant, its ruler emboldened by the visible struggles of the Crusader camp. The Muslim forces used scorched-earth tactics to deny the invaders supplies, while the diseases continued to ravage the Crusader ranks. Louis, increasingly frail and burdened by illness himself, continued to hope for a breakthrough. His faith was unshaken, but his body was beginning to fail. As August turned into September, the Crusaders faced the grim reality that their expedition was unraveling. The dream of converting Tunis, establishing a Christian stronghold in North Africa, and renewing the march toward the Holy Land seemed increasingly distant. What had begun as a bold and unusual strategy to revive the crusading spirit was fast becoming another episode of hardship and loss. The death toll rose daily and the morale of the army hung by a thread. Yet Louis refused to abandon the cause. His sense of duty, his vow, and his unyielding faith kept him in the camp, praying for divine intervention. This was the situation as the first phase of the Eighth Crusade drew to a close. An army encamped among the ruins of ancient Carthage, suffering under the African sun, awaiting reinforcements and guidance while their enemies gathered strength around them. The stage was set for the tragic climax of this ill-fated expedition, where disease would prove a deadlier foe than the sword, and where one of Christendom's most revered kings would meet his end. As the summer sun bore down on the North African coast, The Crusader camp outside Tunis baked beneath a relentless heat. What had begun as a bold expedition to establish a foothold in the Maghreb was rapidly descending into a struggle for survival. Louis IX, the devout king who had once marched on Damietta with unshakable faith, now faced an enemy far more insidious than any Saracen army: disease, famine, and the unforgiving climate of the Tunisian shore. The siege of Tunis, an unyielding stalemate. When the Crusaders landed, their initial movements had been decisive. They captured the fortress of Carthage and established their base near the ruins of the ancient city. From there, they set up lines of fortifications and awaited reinforcements from Sicily. Louis had hoped for a swift confrontation with the forces of the Hafsid Sultan, Muhammad I al-Mustansir. Yet the expected clash never truly came. The Sultan, wary of engaging a European army head-on, employed a strategy of attrition. He ordered his forces to disrupt Crusader supply lines, harass their outposts, and most devastatingly to wait. The heat intensified each day, and the Crusader camp, initially well-ordered, became a breeding ground for disease. Dysentery, malaria, and other illnesses swept through the ranks. Water sources near the camp were scarce and often tainted, leading to further outbreaks. The once proud knights, accustomed to the temperate fields of France and the forests of Europe, now found themselves battling thirst and exhaustion as much as any foe. Louis IX remained steadfast in his piety. He led processions, called for fasts, and exhorted his men to bear their suffering as a form of penance. The papal legates who accompanied him preached perseverance, insisting that divine favor would turn the tide. But morale waned with each passing week. The promised reinforcements under Charles of Anjou, Louis's ambitious brother and king of Sicily, were delayed. Rumors began to circulate in the camp. Some whispered of divine punishment, others of political betrayal. The arrival of Charles of Anjou. At last, in late summer, Charles of Anjou arrived with a contingent of ships and soldiers. His presence injected a brief surge of energy into the Crusader host. Charles, ever the strategist and political opportunist, quickly assessed the situation. Tunis was not the rich, weakly defended prize that some had imagined. It was a well-fortified city, and the Hafsid Sultan was not without resources. The siege, already faltering, would require either a massive escalation or a diplomatic resolution. Charles began to negotiate behind the scenes, even as the Crusaders maintained their lines. His motives were as much about consolidating his influence in the Mediterranean as they were about liberating the Holy Land. He envisioned a North African foothold that would secure trade routes and extend his dominion. Yet the worsening conditions in the Crusader camp left little room for bold offensives. The death of Louis IX. In August 1270, tragedy struck. King Louis IX, the saintly monarch who had led 2 crusades and embodied the ideal of Christian kingship, fell ill. He suffered from high fever, likely caused by dysentery or typhoid. Witnesses described his final days as a mixture of suffering and unwavering devotion. He insisted on being laid on a bed of ashes, in the manner of a penitent, and received the last rites with calm dignity. On August 25, 1270, Louis IX died in his tent before the walls of Tunis. His death sent shockwaves through the Crusader camp and across Christendom. This was no ordinary king. Louis was revered as a model of piety, justice, and humility. His passing effectively ended the crusade as a religious mission. Without his moral authority, the expedition lost its unifying purpose. The French soldiers mourned their monarch deeply, but the practical consequences of his death were immediate. Command passed nominally to his son, the future Philip III, but in reality Charles of Anjou now held the reins of power. Diplomacy over war. Charles, ever pragmatic, shifted the focus from conquest to negotiation. With his own political ambitions in Sicily and southern Italy pressing upon him, he had little interest in prolonging a costly and disease-ridden siege. He opened formal talks with Sultan al-Mustansir, who was equally eager to see the foreign army depart. The Sultan, though confident in his defensive position, had no desire to risk a full-scale assault or see his trade routes permanently disrupted. The resulting treaty was less a triumph of the cross than a calculated compromise. The Hafsid Sultan agreed to resume favorable trade relations with Christian merchants, release Christian captives, and allow free passage for pilgrims to the Holy Land. In return, the Crusaders withdrew their forces from Tunis and recognized the Sultan's sovereignty. The retreat. The Crusader retreat from Tunis was marked by a mixture of relief and regret. Many soldiers, weakened by months of heat and hunger, welcomed the chance to return home. Others, particularly those who had dreamed of striking a blow for Jerusalem, felt that their sacrifices had been wasted. The great crusading ideal, already battered by decades of setbacks, seemed more fragile than ever. Philip III, young and inexperienced, returned to France with the remains of his father. Louis's body was initially buried in the Cathedral of Montreal in Sicily before being transported to Saint-Denis near Paris. There, the memory of the pious king would endure, and in 1297 he would be canonized as Saint Louis, becoming one of the few monarchs to be declared a saint by the Catholic Church. Legacy of the Eighth Crusade. The Eighth Crusade is often remembered less for its military achievements and more for what it symbolized: the waning of the crusading era. Unlike the dramatic campaigns of the First or Third Crusade, this expedition never came close to reclaiming Jerusalem or striking a decisive blow against Islam. Instead, it reflected the shifting priorities of European rulers. Trade, influence, and political advantage often took precedence over the liberation of the Holy Land. The treaty with Tunis, while modest, did secure some commercial and diplomatic benefits for Christian powers in the Mediterranean. It also opened a channel of communication between the Hafsids and the Sicilian kingdom, laying the groundwork for a more interconnected Mediterranean world. For the papacy, the Eighth Crusade was both a disappointment and a warning. Pope Clement IV, who had supported the expedition, recognized that the fervor of the crusading movement was waning. Calls for new crusades would continue, but the enthusiasm that had fueled the great campaigns of the 12th century was fading. The broader decline of the crusading ideal. The failure of the Eighth Crusade highlighted the growing disunity among European powers. Where once kings and nobles had marched together under the banner of the cross, now personal rivalries and dynastic ambitions often overshadowed the stated goal of reclaiming the Holy Land. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, viewed crusades as opportunities for trade monopolies rather than holy war. France and England were increasingly embroiled in their own conflicts, and the Mongol threat in the east further complicated alliances. Louis IX had represented the last great burst of idealism in the crusading movement. His first expedition, the Seventh Crusade, had ended in disaster at Mansurah, and his second had been diverted to North Africa rather than aimed at Jerusalem. His death marked not just the end of a campaign, but the twilight of a century-long dream. Reflection on Louis IX's role. Historians often debate whether Louis IX was a visionary saint or a misguided zealot. His personal piety was unquestionable. He fasted, prayed, administered justice with fairness, and dedicated his life to the service of God. Yet his crusades consumed vast resources and cost thousands of lives with little tangible result. In death, however, he became a powerful symbol of Christian kingship, and his canonization ensured that his name would live on as Saint Louis. The Eighth Crusade did not deliver Jerusalem. It did not establish a new Crusader state. But it did leave behind a legacy of treaties, trade routes, and a saint king whose memory outshone the military failures of his campaigns. A quiet departure. By late autumn of 1270, the Crusader fleets departed Tunisian shores. The wind carried the banners of France and Sicily back toward the Mediterranean, leaving behind only the echoes of their encampments and the graves of thousands who had succumbed to disease. The Hafsid Sultan resumed control of his lands, wealthier for the tribute and trade concessions he had secured. For the people of North Africa, the crusade had been a disruption but not a catastrophe. For Europe, it was another chapter in a long story of ambition, faith, and failure. And for the crusading movement, it was one step closer to its inevitable end. By the time the Ninth Crusade was conceived, the era of the great crusading movements was waning. Nearly 2 centuries had passed since the First Crusade had captured Jerusalem, and in that time the Crusader States had been carved, defended, lost, and recaptured multiple times. The fervor that had once driven kings, knights, and peasants to leave their homelands and fight in the Holy Land was now a faded echo. Europe was exhausted from repeated campaigns that drained treasuries, cost countless lives, and left little lasting impact on the region. The Seventh and Eighth Crusades had ended in disappointment and disease, and the remaining Crusader strongholds along the Levantine coast were fragile remnants rather than thriving kingdoms. Into this fragile landscape entered the figure who would lead what history remembers as the last major crusading effort: Prince Edward of England, later to become Edward I. Edward was the son of King Henry III of England and Eleanor of Provence. Born in 1239, he grew up during a time when the crusading ideal still held a degree of prestige, though it was no longer the unifying force it had been in the days of the First and Second Crusades. By the late 1260s, Edward had established himself as a capable and ambitious noble. He had fought in the Second Barons' War in England, suppressing the rebellion led by Simon de Montfort. In 1269 he took the cross following a long-standing vow and a promise to his uncle, King Louis IX of France, who had twice embarked on crusading expeditions. However, unlike Louis's grand undertakings, Edward's crusade would be far more modest in scale. The context in which Edward planned his expedition was one of increasing Mamluk power in the region. The Ayyubid dynasty that had once ruled Egypt and much of Syria had been overthrown by the Mamluks, a military caste of former slave soldiers who rose to power under the formidable Sultan Baybars. Baybars had already inflicted serious blows on the Crusader presence. He captured Caesarea and Arsuf, and his forces were gradually choking the remaining Frankish strongholds. Only a few key ports such as Acre, Tyre, and Tripoli remained under Crusader control, serving as fragile footholds on the eastern Mediterranean. Edward initially planned to join the Eighth Crusade under his uncle Louis IX, but when Louis diverted his forces to Tunis in 1270 and ultimately perished there from illness, the grand vision of a renewed conquest of the Holy Land collapsed. Edward, however, resolved to continue. With a small force, estimates suggest between 1,000 and 2,000 men, including a few hundred knights, archers and retainers, he set sail from Sicily in the spring of 1271. This was not the massive army of the First Crusade, nor the royal coalition of the Third. It was a modest, almost symbolic expedition, but it carried with it the weight of a crusading vow and the lingering hopes of Christendom. The voyage across the Mediterranean was relatively uneventful, though Edward and his companions faced the usual perils of seafaring: unpredictable winds, the threat of pirates, and the challenge of provisioning their ships for a long journey. Their destination was Acre, the principal Crusader stronghold and the de facto capital of the remaining Christian territories in the Levant. Acre was a bustling port city, cosmopolitan in character, where merchants from Genoa, Venice, and Pisa traded goods from east and west. It was also a city under constant threat, for Baybars had long sought to bring it under his control. Edward arrived in Acre in May 1271. The political situation he found was complex. The Crusader States were fragmented, their leaders often more concerned with their own rivalries than with mounting a unified defense. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was now a kingdom in name only. Its monarch, Hugh III of Lusignan, ruled primarily from Cyprus, leaving the mainland territories to local lords and military orders such as the Templars and Hospitallers. The Mongols, who had once been seen as potential allies against the Muslims, had recently suffered defeats and withdrawn much of their forces from the region. Baybars, ever the strategist, had secured truces with some Crusader factions while attacking others, keeping them divided and off balance. Edward's arrival brought a flicker of renewed hope, though few believed he could turn the tide by himself. His small army represented more a gesture of support than a serious attempt to retake Jerusalem. Nevertheless, Edward was determined to make his presence felt. He began by strengthening alliances with the remaining Crusader leaders and sending envoys to the Mongols in Persia, hoping to revive the earlier idea of a Franco-Mongol alliance. This was a strategy that had tantalized European leaders for decades, the thought of combining Western knights with Mongol cavalry to strike at the heart of the Muslim world. But the timing was poor. The Mongol Ilkhanate was preoccupied with its own struggles against rival khanates and offered only vague promises of assistance. With no large reinforcements forthcoming, Edward turned to what his limited forces could achieve: swift raids and localized campaigns designed to harass Baybars' territories and remind the Muslims that the Crusaders were not yet gone. In the summer of 1271, he launched an expedition into the plains of Galilee, striking at villages and small fortresses. These operations were militarily minor, but they had symbolic value, demonstrating that the Crusaders still had the will to fight. Assassinations and the slow fading of crusading dreams. Baybars, however, was no ordinary foe. The Mamluk Sultan was a master of both war and diplomacy. He had little reason to fear Edward's small force, but he recognized that even a minor crusading army could disrupt his plans if left unchecked. Rather than committing to a full-scale confrontation, Baybars employed a mixture of skirmishes and negotiation. He probed Edward's positions, tested his defenses, and sent envoys to open channels of communication. At the same time, he pressed on with his own campaigns against remaining Crusader fortresses further north. During these early months of Edward's crusade, the morale among the Crusaders was mixed. On one hand, the presence of a royal leader from the west, albeit only a prince at this time, revived the crusading ideal. On the other, the lack of substantial reinforcements, the memory of past failures, and the looming power of Baybars cast a long shadow. Disease was always a threat in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of Acre, and the summer heat made campaigning difficult. Edward himself was an active and resolute commander. He participated in councils, inspected fortifications, and personally led some of the smaller raids. Chroniclers describe him as tall, with a commanding presence, traits that would later earn him the nickname Longshanks. His leadership style combined chivalric ideals with a pragmatic understanding of the limited resources at his disposal. He knew that this crusade would not be the great reconquest that his predecessors had dreamed of. Rather, it was a chance to honor his vow, to show the flag of Christendom in the Holy Land, and perhaps to lay the groundwork for a larger effort in the future. The presence of the military orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, was both a boon and a complication. These orders possessed their own fortresses, fleets, and political interests, and they did not always agree on strategy. Edward attempted to coordinate with them, but their internal rivalries often hampered unified action. Genoese and Venetian merchants, too, played their part, sometimes supplying the Crusaders, sometimes cutting deals with the Mamluks when it suited their trade interests. Throughout the latter half of 1271, Edward's forces continued their limited operations. They attempted, unsuccessfully, to capture Kakin, a small but strategically placed fortress. They skirmished along the coastal roads and disrupted Mamluk supply lines when possible. None of these actions reversed the balance of power, but they prevented Baibars from claiming complete dominance. For Baibars, the crusade was an annoyance rather than a mortal threat, but he was cautious enough to avoid overextending his forces. As the year drew to a close, winter rains brought a lull in campaigning. Edward strengthened Acre's defenses, trained his men, and sent more urgent requests for aid to the west. But Europe was distracted. England was dealing with its own political affairs, France was mourning the loss of Louis IX and reorganizing under Philip III, and the papacy lacked the energy or influence to launch another grand crusade. The days when a pope could summon tens of thousands to the Holy Land were gone. Yet Edward remained undeterred. He had come to the Levant to fulfill his vow, and he would continue the struggle as best he could. The Ninth Crusade, like many before it, was shaped as much by the determination of a few individuals as by the grand strategies of kings and sultans. In the spring of 1272, as the weather warmed and the campaigning season returned, both Edward and Baibars prepared for the next phase of this delicate conflict, one that would see intrigue attempted. The arrival of Prince Edward's forces in Acre had given the Crusader States a temporary sense of hope, but that hope was fragile, almost illusory. The Crusader territories were by now reduced to a narrow strip along the Levantine coast. Cities that once stood as proud fortresses of Christendom, Jerusalem, Antioch, and many inland strongholds, were long lost to Muslim power, especially under the leadership of the Mamluk Sultan Baibars. Edward's expedition was more of a desperate reinforcement than a full-scale crusade, and though he had managed some raids and brief military actions in the first months, the situation remained overwhelmingly grim. By the beginning of 1272, Edward's forces faced multiple obstacles: dwindling supplies, lack of reinforcements from Europe, and the overwhelming strength and strategy of Baibars. The Sultan had already proven himself a master tactician, having recaptured key Crusader cities in previous years and fortified his control over the region. He understood that Edward's crusade lacked the numbers to truly challenge him. Thus, rather than committing to a large, decisive battle, Baibars engaged in a war of attrition, harassing Crusader positions, cutting supply lines, and biding his time while European interest in the crusade continued to fade. Negotiations and political maneuvering. In an unexpected twist, the Ninth Crusade was marked more by diplomacy than by bloody battles. Edward, realizing that a large-scale campaign was impossible with his limited forces, sought alliances with local powers opposed to Baibars. One such potential ally was the Mongol Ilkhanate under Abaka Khan. The Mongols had a common interest in weakening Mamluk power in the Levant, and earlier crusades had also tried to coordinate with them. Edward sent envoys to the Mongols, hoping for a joint campaign, but only a small Mongol force conducted minor raids in northern Syria. Their impact was brief and Baibars quickly regained control. Simultaneously, diplomatic feelers were sent to negotiate a truce. Baibars, ever the strategist, saw little reason to fight an extended war when the Crusaders were clearly on the decline. He opened channels of communication, both to buy time and to ensure that the remaining Crusader ports could be dealt with on his terms later. The truce talks did not result in a formal peace treaty, but they slowed down major military action. Edward, frustrated by the lack of significant military progress, began to understand that his crusade might never achieve the grand victories of the past. The assassination attempt. One of the most dramatic episodes of the Ninth Crusade occurred not on the battlefield but within the walls of Acre itself. In June 1272, a messenger claiming to bear a letter from Sultan Baybars was admitted to Edward's quarters. However, the messenger was an assassin, armed with a poisoned dagger. He lunged at Edward, managing to wound him in the arm or side, accounts vary. Edward fought back, reportedly killing the assailant with his own hands or with the help of his guards. The wound, however, was serious, and fears of poisoning spread quickly through the Crusader camp. Medieval medicine offered few reliable treatments for such wounds. Surgeons attempted to clean the injury, and some chroniclers wrote that Edward's wife, Eleanor of Castile, even tried to suck the poison from the wound, a story more legendary than confirmed. What is certain is that Edward came close to death but eventually recovered, though the incident deeply shook the morale of his already strained forces. Waning European support. Back in Europe, the enthusiasm for crusading had declined sharply since the time of the First and Third Crusades. The idea of reclaiming Jerusalem had lost its urgency after repeated failures, and the costs of these expeditions were enormous. France was still reeling from the disastrous Eighth Crusade, which had ended with the death of King Louis IX in Tunis. England, too, was facing political and financial pressures that limited its ability to send reinforcements. Edward received word that his father, King Henry III of England, had died in late 1272. This news made his presence in England urgent. As the new King Edward I, he had to return to secure his realm. With little left to accomplish in the Holy Land, and with most Crusader leaders favoring a negotiated truce over prolonged conflict, the decision was made to withdraw. The withdrawal and aftermath. By September 1272, Edward had negotiated a 10-year truce with Baybars. This agreement temporarily ensured the survival of what remained of the Crusader States, mainly the coastal cities of Acre, Tyre, and a few fortresses. However, it was a hollow victory. The Crusade had failed to achieve any meaningful territorial gains, had not reclaimed Jerusalem, and had demonstrated that Europe no longer had the unity or resources to mount a serious crusading effort. Edward departed the Holy Land in the late months of 1272, leaving behind a garrison but no lasting hope of revival. His departure marked one of the final chapters in the history of the Crusades. Within 2 decades, the Mamluks would capture Acre in 1291, ending the Crusader presence in the Levant entirely. Legacy of the Ninth Crusade. The Ninth Crusade is often seen less as a major crusade and more as an extension of the Eighth. Its limited scope, reliance on diplomacy, and lack of decisive military action set it apart from the grand campaigns of the past. Yet it is significant as the final attempt by European monarchs to project power into the Holy Land under the banner of crusading. For Edward I, the crusade was a formative experience. He learned valuable lessons about leadership, warfare, and diplomacy, which he would later apply during his reign in England and during his campaigns in Wales and Scotland. For the Crusader States, however, the Ninth Crusade offered only a temporary reprieve. The era of crusading zeal that had begun with the call of Pope Urban II in 1095 had now withered into half-hearted expeditions, more symbolic than strategic. The broader decline of crusading. The end of the Ninth Crusade reflected larger changes in Europe and the Middle East. The papacy no longer held the same sway over European kings, who were increasingly preoccupied with their own dynastic and territorial ambitions. Trade and diplomacy began to replace religious war as the main form of interaction between Europe and the Muslim world. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa benefited from commerce rather than conquest, and the idea of holy war slowly faded. In the Muslim world, leaders like Baybars and his Mamluk successors consolidated their hold over the region, proving that the Crusaders could no longer pose a serious threat. The failure of the Ninth Crusade demonstrated that the age of crusading as a dominant force in Mediterranean politics was effectively over. Final departure. Edward's fleet left Acre quietly, without the fanfare or triumph that had accompanied earlier Crusader departures. There was no great celebration, no reclaimed holy city, no banner of victory to carry home. Instead, the Crusaders sailed back to Europe with weary hearts and a lingering sense of what might have been. The Crusader garrisons left behind knew that their time was running out. With every passing year, the Mamluks tightened their grip on the region, cutting off trade, raiding outposts, and preparing for the final blow that would come in 1291. The Ninth Crusade thus stands as a somber coda to 2 centuries of crusading, brave in intent but ultimately futile in execution. Conclusion. The Ninth Crusade, 1271–1272, was neither a grand conquest nor a total disaster. It was, in many ways, a reflection of its time, an age when the crusading ideal had lost its luster, when diplomacy outweighed battle, and when the once mighty cause of reclaiming the Holy Land had become a shadow of its former self. It ended not with a clash of swords, but with a handshake and a truce, a quiet farewell to the age of Crusaders. As the 13th century drew to a close, the Crusader dream that had begun with such zeal nearly 200 years earlier was fading. The Holy Land, once dotted with castles, strongholds and Christian-held ports, had been steadily shrinking under the pressure of powerful Muslim dynasties, shifting alliances and the waning will of Europe. The Ninth Crusade, led by Prince Edward of England in 1271–1272, had been little more than a final flare of ambition. Its limited campaigns and temporary truce with Sultan Baybars bought only a short reprieve. The Crusader States, reduced now mainly to a few coastal cities, were shadows of the kingdoms once carved from the Levant. The weakening of the Crusader States. By the late 13th century, the Crusader States were no longer unified, nor were they wealthy enough to defend themselves effectively. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had long since lost its namesake city, with its government now seated in Acre, the strongest remaining port on the Mediterranean. Other cities like Tyre, Tripoli, and Beirut were under constant threat or had already been absorbed by the Mamluks, the powerful dynasty that ruled Egypt and Syria. European interest had also waned. The once mighty zeal of the First and Second Crusades had been replaced by political concerns at home. England and France were increasingly embroiled in their own rivalries, while the papacy, once the driving force behind these expeditions, was losing its ability to rally unified armies of faith. Merchants from Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, were more concerned with trade treaties than holy wars, often negotiating with Muslim rulers even as their governments paid lip service to the Crusader cause. The rise of the Mamluks. The greatest force arrayed against the Crusaders in this final period was the Mamluk Sultanate. First under Sultan Baybars and later under his successor, Sultan Calawin, the Mamluks pursued a systematic policy of eradicating the Crusader presence from the Levant. Baybars had already captured key strongholds such as Antioch in 1268, dealing a crippling blow to Crusader influence in northern Syria. Calawin continued this policy with relentless determination. He understood that as long as the Crusader ports survived, they could be used as launching points for new invasions from Europe. He tightened his grip around Acre, Tripoli and Tyre, isolating them one by one. In 1289 the county of Tripoli fell after a brutal siege, leaving Acre as the last significant Crusader bastion in the Holy Land. The Fall of Acre, 1291. Acre had become not only the capital of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem but also its last major lifeline. It was a bustling city of merchants, mercenaries, pilgrims and refugees from other fallen territories. But it was also divided. Rival orders such as the Templars, Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights each held their own fortresses and political ambitions within its walls. Disputes among European merchants and local rulers further weakened the city's unity. In 1290, a violent incident sparked the wrath of Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, son of Calawin. European crusaders, recently arrived from Italy, attacked Muslim merchants and pilgrims during a fragile truce, killing many and violating agreements. Khalil used this as a pretext to mobilize a massive army and march upon Acre. In April 1291 the siege began. The Mamluk army, numbering tens of thousands, encircled the city with siege towers, trebuchets and a relentless barrage of projectiles. Inside, a garrison of Templars, Hospitallers, and remaining Crusader forces prepared for a desperate defense. Appeals for reinforcements to Europe brought no meaningful help. The days of great Crusader hosts crossing the sea were over. The siege lasted for several weeks. Despite fierce resistance, including sorties from the walls and naval support from a few remaining Crusader ships, the Mamluk forces breached Acre's defenses in May 1291. Street fighting erupted as the defenders retreated to the citadel. Civilians, merchants and soldiers alike tried to escape by sea, many drowning as overloaded boats capsized in the harbor. The Templars made a final stand in their fortress, but even their legendary fortifications could not withstand the relentless assault. By the end of May, Acre had fallen. Its inhabitants were killed, enslaved or fled. The once mighty city, the jewel of the Crusader presence, was reduced to ruins. The end of an era. The fall of Acre effectively ended the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. Within a few months, the remaining coastal outposts, Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut, were abandoned or surrendered without significant resistance. Cyprus became the new base for the remnants of the Crusader nobility, but the dream of holding the Holy Land was gone. The military orders that had once defined the crusading spirit were forced to relocate their headquarters. The Hospitallers would eventually move to Rhodes and later Malta, while the Templars entered a period of decline that would culminate in their suppression in the early 14th century. The papacy called for new crusades, but these were half-hearted affairs, lacking both the manpower and the unified spirit that had characterized the early expeditions. Legacy and aftermath. The decline and fall of the Crusader States marked the end of nearly 2 centuries of intermittent war between Western Christendom and the Islamic powers of the Middle East. For Europe, the Crusades left a mixed legacy. They had stimulated trade, cultural exchange, and even technological advancement, but they had also drained resources and entrenched mutual hostility between Christians and Muslims. For the Muslim world, the victory over the Crusaders was a triumph of persistence and strategy, particularly under the leadership of dynasties like the Mamluks. Yet the region remained a crossroads of conflict, soon to face new challenges from the Mongols and later the Ottoman Turks. The people who had once believed that they could create a permanent Christian kingdom in the Levant were now scattered. Pilgrimages to Jerusalem continued under Muslim rule, but the era of Crusader fortresses, Latin princes, and papal legates had come to a definitive end. Conclusion. By 1300, the Crusader states were a memory, their castles crumbling along the Levantine coast, their banners torn and their orders scattered across the Mediterranean. The Fall of Acre in 1291 symbolized the final closing of a chapter that had begun with the fiery preaching of the First Crusade in 1095. What had once been called the Holy Land of Christendom was now firmly under Muslim rule, and Europe turned its gaze inward and toward other frontiers. The Crusades had reshaped the medieval world, but they had also revealed the limits of religious war. In the end, the decline and fall of the Crusader states was not the result of a single battle but a long erosion, of unity, of purpose, and of the will to continue a war that had lost its direction.